Here is where every Major League Baseball team is today. And here's what the map looked like in 1903, the year of the first World Series. From 1903 to 1952, a period of 50 seasons, this map remained unchanged, and every team in Major League Baseball existed in this small area. No teams moved, no teams folded, there was no change in the makeup of Major League Baseball this entire time. That stability was unprecedented in professional sports in the first half of the 1900s. The NFL didn't even exist until 1920, but over its first 30 years, it would see 10 teams move, 5 teams leave the league, a whopping 38 teams fold, and all of this covering 43 different cities across the United States. The NBA wasn't founded until 1946, and in its first 10 years, 3 teams left the league, 11 teams folded, and covered a footprint of 23 different cities. Meanwhile, Major League Baseball was the same 16 teams in the same 10 cities. This would radically change starting in 1953. Over the next 20 years, Major League Baseball would see 10 teams relocate, along with 8 expansion franchises. The area covered by the league would go from 210,000 square miles to 2.6 million square miles, and attendance would increase by 106%. But just looking at the map over these 20 years doesn't come close to telling the full story. Each one of these moves and expansions includes cabals and backroom politics, backstabbing and sabotaging, disenfranchised fans losing their team, and elated fans to get a new team, and even the destruction of communities completely unrelated to baseball. It involved the machinations of some of the most wealthy men in the United States, treating a game beloved by many as a way to increase their net worth and power. And we'll get into all of that after the intro. One thing that was clear in 1952 is there were cities that had multiple MLB teams that could not financially support multiple teams, at least not to the extent that an untapped market could. Philadelphia, St. Louis, and Boston all had 2 teams, and even if the fan base were split 50-50 between the respective teams in those cities, which it wasn't, half the population of those metro areas was smaller than metro areas that had 0 teams. St. Louis metro area, for instance, had about 1.7 million population in 1950. If you half that to 850,000, there were 6 more metro areas larger than that didn't have a team: Los Angeles, San Francisco, Baltimore, Minneapolis, Buffalo, and Milwaukee. And again, this is assuming the fan base in St. Louis is split 50-50 between the Cardinals and Browns. In 1950, the Cardinals had an attendance of 1.1 million, while the Browns had an attendance of a paltry 250,000. There was a similar discrepancy between the teams in Philadelphia, with the Phillies getting 1.2 million attendance in 1950 versus 300,000 for the Athletics, and Boston, with the Red Sox, getting 1.35 million in attendance versus 950,000 for the Braves. There always seemed to be a team that played second fiddle, and the owners of those teams wanted to get out of that situation and have a city of their own. On paper, it seemed that was going to be the Philadelphia Athletics, Boston Braves, and St. Louis Browns to be the first teams to move. However, Bill Veeck had other ideas. Of all the owners in MLB history, he stands out. He was the last owner without an independent fortune to buy a team. His entire life circled around baseball, specifically operating and owning baseball teams. He had a reputation of being willing to do anything to get fans through the turnstiles, including a number of ideas, promotions, and gimmicks to accomplish this. Some of the things he tried out still exist today. Fireworks after a home run, that was Bill Veeck. Curtain calls, Bill Veeck. Planting ivy on the Wrigley Field wall, Bill Veeck. Harry Carey singing "Take Me Out to the Ball Game" during the 7th inning stretch, which the Cubs still honor for every home game to this day, Bill Veeck. But not everything he tried worked. Some promotions were disastrous or had massive blowback from the league, such as signing little person Eddie Goodell, which made the league add a clause that all player contracts had to be approved by the commissioner, having players wear shorts instead of pants, Disco Demolition Night in Chicago, which led to riots and the White Sox forfeiting the game, Many people in baseball considered him a huckster, carnival barker, an owner that was degrading the quality and prestige of the game due to prioritizing showmanship and spectacle. But behind the showy promoter, there was also an honorable person that cared about his players, cared about the community the team was involved in, and supported racial integration of the league. His Cleveland Indians signed Larry Doby, who was the first black player in the American League, and also signed Negro League legend Satchel Paige, who became the oldest rookie in Major League history at 42 years old. He signed the 56-year-old Minnie Minoso to play for the White Sox in 1980, just so Minoso could be one of only 3 players in MLB history to play across 5 decades. In a move that would have changed the entire history of integration of Major League Baseball, Veeck claims in 1943, 4 years before the debut of Jackie Robinson, he had secured funding to buy the Philadelphia Phillies with the plan to replace all the players with Negro League All-Stars for the 1943 season, a plan that Veeck claimed would guarantee them the pennant. But after informing National League President Ford Frick of his plans, his bid to buy the team was shut down by the league. Now, whether that story actually happened is another bit of Veeck history that is up for debate by baseball historians, but knowing Veeck's track record and the evidence available, nobody can definitively say that it's 100% false. One thing was clear though, for the most part, his stunts worked. The first team he owned, the minor league Milwaukee Brewers in the 1940s, had a complete turnaround in both attendance and team performance under his watch, going from a team on the verge of bankruptcy and last in the standings to winning 3 pennants in a row and Veeck selling them for nearly $250,000 profit from his purchase price. His run as owner of the Cleveland Indians was an even more impressive turnaround. The season before Veeck bought them, the Indians only had 558,000 in attendance. In Veeck's 3rd year as owner, attendance had increased to 2.6 million and the Indians won the 1948 World Series. He was loved in Cleveland and he could have been the long-term owner, but he had to sell the team in 1949 in order to pay out his divorce settlement. But that would not be the end of Veeck in baseball. Just 2 years after selling the Indians, Veeck had stabilized his finances from the divorce and purchased the St. Louis Browns. The Browns were a pitiful franchise, constantly near the bottom of the league in both attendance and in the standings. Dwarfed in popularity by the other franchise in St. Louis, the Cardinals, it would seem Veeck was buying the Browns with the intention to move them to another city, an unclaimed city, one without another franchise to compete with. But that was not his plan. I did come into St. Louis, and I'll make this as clear as possible too, knowing perfectly well that the city could support only one team. I had been saying for years that the only cities in the country who could support 2 teams were Chicago and New York. That would seem to mean only one thing. I had come into St. Louis to try to run the Cardinals out of town. The Cardinal owner was Fred Sy, an attorney. Sy was wealthier than me, of course, but he did not have unlimited wealth. That meant he could be run out of town. He didn't have unlimited experience in running a baseball team either. As I saw it, Sy didn't have the foggiest notion of what he was doing. The 1952 season saw Veeck engage in a relentless campaign to make the Browns the #1 team in town. Veeck got wind that Sy was planning to fire Cardinals player-coach Marty Marion, an 11-year veteran with the team, and replace him with Cardinals legend Rogers Hornsby to manage the team. Veeck saw an opportunity. Hornsby was the greatest player the Cardinals ever had. He had managed them to their first pennant. If I could hire Hornsby out from under Sy, I'd have the returning hero and I'd also have given Sy something else to brood on. If he then fired Marion anyway, I would hire Marion as a player coach and have 2 of the greatest Cardinal names on my roster. Veeck immediately contacted Hornsby, offered him a contract that severely outbid what Sy was offering, and secured his new manager. Sure enough, Sy later fired Marion and Veeck pounced again. He signed Dizzy Dean to do radio broadcasts for the team. Dean was possibly the best pitcher in Cardinals history up to that point, and that year there was a movie made about his life called The Pride of St. Louis. Veeck's intentions were as clear as day. He was going to make it so fans in St. Louis identified with the Browns over the Cardinals. But he didn't stop there. The Cardinals and Browns played in the same stadium, Sportsman's Park. Veeck owned the stadium, and the Cardinals rented it out from him for games. Veeck used this to his advantage. I painted the walls on our side of the park and left his side unwashed, unpainted, and untouched. I barred him from using our special press room or our fancy private box when the Cardinals were playing at home. In decorating the park, we put up murals of old St. Louis heroes on the walls behind the concession stands. By coincidence, they were all pictures of old St. Louis Browns players. Veeck also attacked the Cardinals roster. I kept after him by putting in claims for everybody he wanted to send to the minors, for I was sure he would withdraw them rather than give me a chance to get another Cardinal on my roster. Some of those moves did backfire, most notably hiring Rogers Hornsby as manager. The players hated Hornsby, which hit a tipping point after Hornsby wouldn't let infielder Bobby Young visit his wife, who was going through a difficult pregnancy, in Baltimore during a team road trip to Washington, D.C. Veeck had to intervene to let Young take leave from the team. I called Raj. "Hey," I said, "what's the matter with you? Young is worried sick about his wife. Let him go home. I'm informing you, as president of this club, that I'm going to call Bill Durney as soon as I hang up and tell him to give Young permission to go home now and for the rest of the series." Veeck ended up firing Hornsby on June 10th, and the Browns players, so ecstatic to be rid of Hornsby, threw a party in the clubhouse after the game that day and took up a collection to buy a silver cup as a gift to Veeck inscribed, "To Bill Veeck, for the greatest play since the Emancipation Proclamation, June 10th, 1952, from the players of the St. Louis Browns," which got Veeck in some hot water as the press speculated, ever the showman, Veeck was the one that coordinated this gift, something that Veeck vehemently denied. The crazy thing is, these efforts to court the fans in St. Louis were starting to work. From 1951 to 1952, the Browns' attendance went from 294,000 to 519,000, while the Cardinals' attendance dropped from 1 million to 913,000. Still a long way to go, but if this trend continued, with relocation seeming like a very lucrative option at the time, maybe Veeck would get his way of chasing Cy and the Cardinals out of town. But then something unexpected happened, something which at first looked like Veeck had won. Fred Cy was found guilty of tax evasion, sentenced to 15 months in prison, and forced to sell the Cardinals on short notice. Cy had meetings with representatives in Houston as well as Milwaukee. Lloyd Larson of the Milwaukee Sentinel claimed that an unnamed team official told him that Milwaukee and the state of Wisconsin are entitled to more than a big league franchise. They should have the best baseball can work out. The transfer must come from a western city. That means the Cardinals are it, so we're ready to move when the stadium is completed. Veeck said of the Houston possibility, "I almost did have it made. In negotiating to sell his club, Cy went down to Houston to talk to some Texas millionaires. The Cardinals owned the Houston club in the Texas League, so the association was close. There was no question that the money was there. It was just a matter of making the Houston park acceptable. I came that close." And then, out of nowhere, came Gussie Busch with his full-bodied and well-foamed bankroll. Gussie Busch was the owner of Anheuser-Busch. Veeck had been trying to make the Browns identify with the city of St. Louis, and his competition just got bought out by a company that was synonymous with the city. I wasn't going to run Gussie Busch out of town, and I certainly wasn't going to run Anheuser-Busch Inc. out of town. I knew I had been knocked out of the box. And with that, it was settled, and Veeck knew he was beat. It was clear the Cardinals would be the team to play in St. Louis, and the Browns would be the ones to move. Veeck made it known to the league that he intended to move the Browns either to Milwaukee or Baltimore for the 1953 season. But he was in for a surprise that offseason. Veeck's main weakness as an owner was he was a man of his word, straightforward in his dealings, who wore his intentions on his sleeve. If he had a goal, he was very open in saying so.
I forever will remember Bill Veeck as a man of integrity, a man of honesty.
Meanwhile, the other owners were not so forthright. For you Game of Thrones fans out there, the 1952 offseason for Veeck played out like Ned Stark. Saddled with a franchise in St. Louis that had no future in the city, desperate to move to stay afloat, and requiring approval from the other owners provided those other owners the perfect opportunity to get rid of that troublemaker Bill Veeck. First was Milwaukee. It was the logical destination for the Browns. Not only had Veeck previously owned and operated a team in Milwaukee for 5 years, the city was building a new $5 million stadium with the intention of eventually landing a major league team. But there was one problem. Veeck had sold the Milwaukee Brewers to Oscar Salinger in 1945. In 1946, Salinger sold the Brewers to Lou Perini, owner of the Boston Braves, making the Brewers the Braves' AAA affiliate and giving Perini control over territorial rights to the city. Any major league team wishing to move to Milwaukee would have to go through Perini first. The only way this would be a problem is if Perini intended to move his Boston Braves to Milwaukee, which did make a bit of sense. The Braves had the same problem as the Browns, where they were the lesser team in a two-team city that couldn't support two teams, and the Braves had sunk to the lowest attendance in the league in 1952 with just 281,000. But even though it made sense, Perini was adamant he had no intentions of moving the Braves to Milwaukee, stating in December of 1952, "The Braves will definitely remain in Boston in 1953. When talking about his plans for Boston, "When the time comes along, I'll improve the park," with a reporter noting that certainly doesn't sound like a fly-by-night promoter who has any idea of selling or moving the Boston Braves franchise. As weeks went on, and Veeck's intention to move to Milwaukee was clear, reports were that Perini still had no intention to move. Perini has spoken of moving the Braves there, but my Milwaukee informant assures me Perini has given no assurance as to when, if ever, he would switch. My Boston advisors tell me to forget the whole thing and feel sure that Perini will either stand or fall in his own town. With Perini adamant about keeping the Braves in Boston, Veeck's path to relocating the Browns to Milwaukee was wide open. Veeck just had to buy out the territorial rights to Milwaukee from Perini, and he gave Perini a very generous offer. $750,000 just for the rights, and also giving Perini territorial rights to Toledo, which Veeck had previously acquired in anticipation for this, so the Milwaukee Brewers could relocate there. Considering Perini had bought the Brewers for $250,000 just 5 years earlier, and the Brewers had lost $25,000 in 1952, as long as Perini wasn't intending to move the Braves to Milwaukee, this was a no-brainer deal that he would accept. However, contrary to his public statements, Perini did want to move the Braves to Milwaukee. But owners don't want to look like the bad guy, and publicly stating you want to move a team from one city to another makes you look like the bad guy, especially if plans end up falling through. Bill Veeck had just provided Perini the perfect scapegoat. He declined Veeck's offer for Milwaukee territorial rights and took to the press to explain why. Moving a franchise is a complicated measure. It will take time for any team to move because of various groups which have to sit on negotiations. Arrangements have to be made to replace teams, and there are a lot of other details. A year's advance notice on an application may turn out to not be enough time. I would say right offhand that Bill Veeck not only won't be moving to Milwaukee for next April's opening, but he won't for 1954 either. But fans in both Milwaukee and Boston did not react well to this. Milwaukee was ecstatic at the possibility of upgrading from the minor leagues to the major leagues, and newspapers were reporting the Browns' move to Milwaukee was pretty much a done deal, until Perini blocked it. Milwaukee fans turned on the Brewers, and the Milwaukee press led the campaign. Some Milwaukee sports writers and sportscasters are claiming that Perini, as president of the Boston Braves, is balking at the city's chances of getting the St. Louis Browns. Wisconsin's biggest city is almost bound to reflect in resentment against the Brewers this summer, usually shown most effectively by fans staying away from the ballpark. At the same time, fans in Boston saw Perini blocking the Browns to Milwaukee as a clear indication that he intended to move the Braves to Milwaukee, and support in Boston for the Braves also evaporated. With fans of both cities revolting against Perini, despite saying less than 3 months earlier that moving a major league team to Milwaukee would be a multi-year process that couldn't be done before the 1953 season, Perini petitioned to the National League in March to allow him to move the Braves from Boston to Milwaukee, just 3 weeks before the season was set to begin, all the while blaming Veeck for forcing his hand. Veeck said of this, "I awoke in time to hear Perini announce that due to the dirty trick I was playing on him, he had no alternative but to move to Milwaukee himself. Perini loved Boston so much, though, that he could not bear to tell them. He kept insisting to the very end that he was staying on to build anew." The Boston Braves to Milwaukee move was approved unanimously by National League owners. Again, just 3 weeks before the season started. The Boston Braves were leading 3-0 in the 5th inning of a spring training game against the Yankees when the city change was announced, making them the Milwaukee Braves for the second half of the game. They ended up losing 5-3. Newspapers joked that the Boston Braves beat the Yankees 3-0, while the Milwaukee Braves lost 5-3. Veeck couldn't believe his bad luck and how things unfolded. Talk about bad timing. If the Milwaukee club had still been independently operated, or if I had been able to buy it from Salinger, I would have moved in with no trouble at all. If Salinger had sold to anybody except the Braves, I would have been able to buy the territorial rights without any difficulty. A year earlier, and Perini would have been willing to sell. A year later, the Braves, who were rebuilding, had leaped from 7th place to 2nd and probably would have drawn well enough in Boston to make it impossible for Perini, a local man, to leave. There is a tide in the affairs of man which, taken at the ebb, leaves you fishing in mudflats. The tide was running low for me. The first domino had fallen. With almost no notice, the Boston Braves became the first team in Major League Baseball to relocate since 1902, which, coincidentally, was the Milwaukee Brewers moving to become the St. Louis Browns. Speaking of the Browns, with them now out on Milwaukee, Veeck turned to his backup plan, moving the team to Baltimore for 1953. But that would end up an even bigger disaster for him than his attempt for Milwaukee.
And I'll use myself as an example. I did move the Browns, although they ultimately ended up moving without me. I would like to say I withdrew gracefully, and that would be a complete untruth. I was thrown out.
At the same time, the National League unanimously approved the Boston Braves moving to Milwaukee. Veeck's proposal to relocate the Browns to Baltimore was up for a vote in the American League. It required 6 of the 8 owners to pass, and by Veeck's count, he had firm commitments for a 6-2 vote, with a strong possibility of a 7-1 vote. He had personal commitments from the White Sox, Indians, Tigers, Athletics, and Senators, which along with his vote was the needed 6. And the Red Sox told him they'd vote with whatever the majority was, making his tally 7. But Veeck underestimated how much some of the other owners despised him and were lying directly to his face. I was brought up to believe that a man's word was good, the greatest handicap I had to overcome as a baseball operator. I had to get thrown out of baseball before I could get it through my head that the word of some of my colleagues was not worth the paper it wasn't written on. In one of his most ill-advised moves as an owner, leading into that offseason, an offseason where he had to get support from the other owners to move his floundering franchise, Veeck proposed some measures calling for the radical changes in the procurement of players and the split of gate receipts and the sharing of television fees. The Yankees and their co-owners Del Webb and Dan Topping had dominated the American League for decades and were by far the most powerful team when it came to not only finances but also influence. They, in Veeck's word, were convinced I was shooting at them. It is fairly obvious, as these things are always obvious in retrospect, that since I knew very well that I might be asking permission to move shortly, I had not picked the best possible time to offend the Yankees. The measures were soundly defeated with a 7-1 vote, Veeck being the only one, but that wasn't the end of it. In retaliation for the proposal, Del Webb got the other American League owners together with a plan to punish Veeck. Even though the American League schedule was already set up and approved for the 1953 season, the owners rewrote the schedule on short notice to deny the Browns night games while on the road, which compounded Veeck's problems and need to relocate the team. They had me. The Browns were as close to being a road team as it is possible to be. I was absolutely dependent upon those road receipts. While we might draw some fairly decent crowds at night, we had no chance of drawing anything on weekdays. Veeck also underestimated how Clark Griffith of the Washington Senators, despite giving Veeck assurances that they would vote for the Browns' relocation to Baltimore, wasn't really fond of a team moving in on his territory on the East Coast. Now here's where we get into conspiracy territory from Veeck, but considering how the final vote went, Veeck might have a point. The American League, and I would suppose all leagues, is filled with cabals and alliances. The Mac boys, Athletics, were the weak link in the league. They wouldn't be sure what their self-interest was in this matter until Griffith told them. Boston and Detroit would always vote with Griffith too. The Yankees' proposition, as I saw it, was that he and his friends would be able to vote for me and leave it up to the Yankees to organize the campaign against me. Just 2 days before the vote, Calvin Griffith, Clark Griffith's son and vice president of the Senators, said, "As far as I know, no club will oppose the shift." Sports writers were saying approval was a done deal. As the vote was happening, Baseball Commissioner Ford Frick, who was apparently unaware of the owner's plan to block Veeck to Baltimore, said, "It looks like St. Louis can't support 2 teams." The fix was in. The owners voted against moving the Browns to Baltimore 6-2, with only the White Sox honoring their pledge to Veeck to vote for the move. With the Boston Braves simultaneously getting approval to go to Milwaukee, this vote seemed to make no sense, except for one reason. The owners wanted to destroy Veeck and force him out of the league. Sports writers had a field day. Shirley Povich of the Washington Post wrote, "Vexed by Veeck since he came into the league, with his bizarre promotions and his demands for some of their rich television profits, they kept him and his Browns out of Baltimore and voted him a slow death in St. Louis. On the pretext that there wasn't time for a franchise shift before the start of the 53 season, they voted down Veeck's ambitious plan to move to Baltimore. But it was a thinly masked revenge act for his misdemeanor in their company. This was their chance to clobber him good, and they didn't muff it. Their simple sentence was, stay in St. Louis. But that was equivalent to applying the torture boot. Veeck is dead in St. Louis, and he knows it, with fans there resentful and unforgiving towards his effort to jilt the town in favor of Baltimore. It was tantamount to telling Veeck he was through in baseball. Arthur Siegel of the Boston Traveler wrote, "The American League magnates did a wonderful hatchet job on Veeck. Everybody left the impression that Bill would be given a full treatment escort into Baltimore. But when the 7 votes were counted, 5 men had voted against the shift of the franchise. They had been embarrassed by him often enough. There was the incident of wanting a slice of the television money. There were various gags he had pulled. His firing of Rogers Hornsby had never set well with many baseball men. They didn't like the way he had put Lou Perini in the middle, and it looks as if they have caught up with him."
Principal reason that the American League was so desirous of throwing me out on my backside was because I was not a willing and cooperative member of the establishment. I felt that we were entitled to go our own way, had stuck a few pins in some stuffed shirts, of which there were a great many, and worst of all, had offended the Yankee hierarchy. At the meeting in New York, it's kind of interesting that one of those 3 gentlemen, actually it was Mr. Topping, bumped into him in an elevator, and he said, "We got you now where we want you. We're going to see you go bankrupt, and then we'll just take the franchise."
The 1953 season was a disaster for Veeck. Losing the battle for the city against the Cardinals in 1952 and not being allowed to move that offseason, fan interest in the team had disappeared. Attendance nearly halved. Veeck had to sell any player he could to stave off bankruptcy, plunging the team into last place, and also sold Sportsman's Park to the Cardinals. And to add insult to injury, the now Milwaukee Braves had an incredibly successful season, both financially and on the field, going from 281,000 in attendance in their last season in Boston to 1.8 million in Milwaukee, as well as finishing with over 90 wins. Veeck made another attempt to move to Baltimore that offseason, but again was voted down, this time 4-4. 4 days after that vote, Baltimore businessman Gerald Hofberger put together a group to buy the Browns from Veeck and relocate them to Baltimore. With Veeck's hands tied financially, he had no other choice but to sell. Once Hofberger officially had control of the team, American League owners approved the move to Baltimore unanimously, making it 100% clear that all the previous votes against Baltimore had nothing to do with the viability of the Browns moving to Baltimore, the timing of the move, or any other factor other than they just wanted to force Veeck out. This, however, would not be the last appearance of Bill Veeck in the American League. The Athletics had a storied history in Philadelphia. Connie Mack was perhaps the most famous non-player figure in baseball for the first half of the century, managing the Athletics for 50 years and leading them to 5 World Series titles. Conversely, the Philadelphia Phillies were an embarrassment of a franchise for most of that half-century. No World Series titles and 13 seasons with over 100 losses. If one of the 2 teams in Philadelphia was forced to relocate prior to 1945, it would have been the Phillies. But the fortunes for both teams had reversed in recent years. Robert Carpenter Jr., heir to the DuPont fortune, bought the Phillies in 1943 and infused lots of cash into their minor league affiliates, scouting, and player acquisitions. The Phillies lost 100 games in 1945, but just 5 years later they won the NL pennant and made the World Series. Meanwhile, the Athletics went in the opposite direction. The year the Phillies won the pennant, the Athletics lost 102 games and only had 25% of the attendance of the Phillies. Even though the Athletics had a great history of winning, the Phillies had supplanted them as Philadelphia's team in just under a decade. And the Athletics were in dire straits financially. The team owed approximately $1.9 million to creditors. The Saturday Evening Post reported the A's couldn't afford even moderate losses for very long. If things turn out as poorly in 1954 as they did last year, when home attendance was only 362,000, it is likely that the club will leave Philadelphia, or change ownership, or both. Roy Mack conceded there were times during both 1953 and 1954 where the A's were short of working capital and had to borrow an additional $150,000 from the Jacobs brothers, Sports Service. He said it would take between $650,000 and $700,000 in home attendance for the team to break even in 1954. Attendance in 1954 was nowhere close to $650,000, coming in at less than half of that. Going into that offseason, the future of the Philadelphia Athletics was the main topic of conversation. Arnold Johnson was a businessman that specialized in a tactic of using borrowed money to buy property from a business and then rent that property back to the business, converting that business's profits into capital gains, a significant tax advantage. And Johnson would pocket some profit after using the rent he received to pay off the loans used to purchase the property, and would then flip the property. This scheme eventually got him involved in baseball when he bought Yankee Stadium from Del Webb and Dan Topping to rent it back to them. They would benefit from capital gains, elimination of real estate and inheritance tax problems, and a write-off of lease rentals under operational expenses. Johnson would benefit on a long-range capital investment basis. Included in the deal was the stadium for the Yankees' AAA affiliate, the Kansas City Blues. Now, as the owner of Kansas City's main baseball stadium, Arnold Johnson was at the center of Kansas City's bid for a major league team. It should be noted, Johnson had no interest in owning a baseball team. He was purely a businessman, and the conditions were perfect where he would make a tidy profit if a team did relocate to Kansas City under his ownership. The city of Kansas City agreed to purchase the stadium from Johnson for his original purchase price and fund renovations and expansion of the stadium as long as Johnson could get a major league team to the city. And with the massive success of the Milwaukee Braves with their relocation, if a team relocated to Kansas City under Johnson's ownership, he could expect a hefty short-term profit during the honeymoon phase. There were many parties coming to the table with bids to buy the Athletics after the 1954 season. Charles O. Finley, a Chicago businessman who wanted to partner with the current A's owner Roy Mack in buying out the other Philadelphia Athletics owners, keep the team in Philadelphia for 1955, and if conditions in the city didn't improve for the team, which they most likely wouldn't, move them to another city. The previously mentioned Arnold Johnson for a move to Kansas City into the stadium he now owned, and the last two groups both intended to move the team to Los Angeles. The first led by Clint Murchison, and the second led by, hey, it's Bill Veeck again. Now, I'm not an expert in politics, but attempting to buy a team whose purchase would require approval by the other owners in the league, the same owners that just forced you out of the league through their votes the previous year, seemed like a bold strategy.
It's a bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see if it pays off for him.
Veeck surprisingly had 3 commitments, which for a vote requiring 6 out of the 8 owners means he had veto power and could dictate where the move would go. Originally thinking he could possibly wield that power to force the owners to reluctantly go with him, he soon realized the remaining owners would rather spite him and keep the failing franchise in Philadelphia than dare hand it over to Veeck in Los Angeles. Not wanting the Mack family to run into the exact same situation the owners put him in the previous year in St. Louis, he dropped out of consideration. Charlie Finley lasted this long in the bidding because he was the only person to actually bring a check to the meetings, showing he had the money. However, he didn't have the support of the owners, specifically Yankees owners Topping and Webb, and was forced to drop out. Murchison was having trouble getting the cash to support his bid, and was further derailed by Commissioner Ford Frick asking for an investigation into Murchison's connections with a gambling operation in California. With the Yankees pushing hard for a vote and the investigation into Murchison taking too long, Murchison dropped his bid. With Finley, Murchison, and Veeck out, this led the owners to approve the sale to Arnold Johnson and the move from Philadelphia to Kansas City for the 1955 season.
I'm very happy to announce that after an all-day session, the American League club members this evening approved the transfer of the Philadelphia Athletics to Kansas City. And I also would like to welcome into the American League Mr. Arnold Johnson as the new owner of the Kansas City Ball Club. Thank you, Mr. Harry. I'm very pleased to know that I've been accepted into the American League. I'll do my best to bring up a good team and provide a lot of competition in the league.
But getting league approval was just half of the equation. The owners of the Athletics, the Mack family, would have to agree to any sale. There were really 3 main shareholders, Connie Mack and his sons Earl and Roy Mack. Connie, who we talked about earlier, was a legend in Philadelphia, and his priorities in 1955 were for him to keep the Athletics in the Mack family. But at 92 years old, that meant relying on both Earl and Roy to be the decision makers. Connie Mack was fixated on the name of Mack, the House of Mack, being forever associated with the Athletics. The narrowness of his thinking ultimately forced the senior Mack to depend on Roy and Earl to perpetuate the empire. Connie Mack should have acted more quickly and decisively to expand the Athletics' ownership by bringing in partners with deep pockets, entrepreneurial drive, a willingness to restructure and invigorate the organization's operations, especially the farm system, and a determination to rejuvenate the front office with new personnel possessing baseball acumen and awareness of how the business of baseball had changed and was being conducted after the Second World War. Earl Mack was essentially a non-factor. He was along for the ride and did whatever the rest of the family told him to do. Earl could have played a pivotal role in the sale of the Philadelphia Athletics, but he did not possess the fortitude, nor could he summon the determination to do more than follow a trail that was being blazed by someone else. His father, Connie, was too infirm to lead from the front, so it fell, by default and not through ability, to Roy Mack to do so. Roy had two priorities: get as much money from the sale as possible and maintain executive positions within the Athletics for both himself and his son so the family could continue to be involved in the team's operations. After the owner's vote approving the sale and move to Kansas City, Philadelphia businessman Jack Rensel led a group making a last-ditch effort to convince the Macks to sell to them in order to keep the team in Philadelphia. The group had 8 members, and each had pledged at least $150,000 to help with the purchase. The Macks had a deadline of October 18th by the league to make a decision if they wanted to sell to Johnson. And on October 17th, they notified the president of the American League that they would sell to Rensel to keep the team in Philadelphia, which came as a surprise to everyone.
First it came out that the Athletics were definitely leaving, and that was it. It was done, seemingly. Then we heard about these 8 businessmen. They were automobile salesmen, parking lot dealers, businessmen in the area. These were the men who were going to keep the Athletics in Philadelphia. Then the whole picture changed. The Inquirer had the headlines that the Athletics were not leaving Philadelphia, they were going to stay in Philadelphia. And thanks to these 8 businessmen, another franchise was saved for our area.
The only obstacle was for the league's owners to vote to approve this sale, which would take place on October 28th. Arnold Johnson was in a panic as he thought the sale to him and move to Kansas City was a done deal. Realizing Roy Mack was the guy he needed to convince, he sent a telegram to Roy. "Dear Roy, unbelievable that you would not talk to me or let me see you before you went off the deep end. That is, agreed to sell the club to the Philadelphia syndicate. Would appreciate courtesy if you call me at Warwick Hotel in the morning. Suggest you do not sign until you get all the facts. Your future and your son's future are at stake." Johnson later discussed with Roy that his offer for the team now included stock interest in the Athletics for Roy, substantial cash, and a position with the Athletics not only for Roy, but also for his son. Considering Roy's priorities, this was music to his ears, and he decided to align himself with Johnson and work to get the owner's vote on the sale to Rensel to fail, even though Roy had previously approved the sale to Rensel. The meeting of AL owners in New York on October 28th provided the forum for Roy, in concert with others sympathetic to Johnson's bid for the A's, to torpedo the agreement with the Philadelphia syndicate. The vote to approve the sale to Rensel's group and keep them in Philadelphia failed 4-4, ending any opportunity to keep the Athletics in Philadelphia.
But then the American League did not okay the purchase by these businessmen. Why? I don't know.
While the ballot was supposed to be secret, it was figured out that the Athletics themselves were one of the no votes, which was a shock to some of the owners as well as Connie Mack himself. That Connie Mack Sr. was blindsided by his son Roy at the meeting became apparent when before the vote the elder Mack made a personal appeal that the Athletics remain in the city under the ownership of the Philadelphia syndicate. Some in the room, almost certainly the Yankees owners, perhaps others, knew the syndicate deal was doomed, and they may have been momentarily saddened at the sight of the once powerful Connie Mack pleading for a cause that was about to be abandoned through machinations in which his own son was complicit. Some of the owners were also peeved that a vote even took place. Those owners who were unaware of the backroom deal between Roy Mack and Arnold Johnson were mystified and more than a little annoyed that they had come to a meeting to consider an offer that the Macks themselves could not agree on. "I will not come to any more meetings until the Mack family has settled their own affairs among themselves," Charles Comiskey Jr., owner of the White Sox, told the press. "It seems they can't make up their minds. There are others who feel the same." A week later, the American League owners reconvened to vote to approve the final purchase of the Athletics by Arnold Johnson, which was approved without issue.
So then it went back to Arnold Johnson, and he made another bid, and it was final then. We didn't have the Athletics anymore.
It was official. For the 1955 season, the team would be the Kansas City Athletics. You may have noticed a trend from all of these events. The Yankees pushed hard for a vote, forcing Murchison to drop out. The Yankees didn't support Charlie Finley's bid, forcing Finley to drop out. Bill Veeck tells another story of Yankees co-owner Del Webb further sabotaging the two Los Angeles bids. In every city that has won a big league franchise, a single newspaper man has led the campaign. In Los Angeles, it was Vincent X. Flaherty, who conducted the greatest one-man campaign over a period of years I have ever seen. Webb walked into the meeting still vowing to support Flaherty, and as soon as the door was shut behind him, he got up and announced that Los Angeles wasn't ready for big league baseball. Here's where it gets funny. As soon as the franchise was voted to Kansas City, Webb dashed out of the conference room, rushed to a phone, and called Flaherty in Los Angeles to assure him that he had done his best to get the franchise for Los Angeles, but that Clark Griffith, out of his old friendship to Connie Mack, had been hot for Kansas City. Old Uncle Clark, said Mr. Webb to Mr. Flaherty, had been too strong for him. What made it so outrageous was that Griffith led the battle against Kansas City. Connie Mack's wife, Catherine Mack, even said in a press conference, "New York wants this club to move to Kansas City, and when New York's in the back pushing it, well, there's your answer." Arnold Johnson was already a business partner to Del Webb and Dan Topping, owning both Yankee Stadium and the stadium for the Kansas City Blues. The Yankees had significant short-term and possibly long-term financial interests in the sale to Kansas City. They would also benefit on the field as their leverage over Johnson, as well as speculation that Johnson's ownership in the A's was intended to be short-term, eventually flipping the team to the West Coast for a profit, would mean the Kansas City Athletics would become a Yankee feeder team. Between 1955 and 1960, the period where Johnson owned the A's, the Yankees and Athletics completed 16 trades involving 58 players. In most cases, the trades brought the Yankees prized prospects, while leaving the Athletics with over-the-hill stars. The Yankees won the AL title 5 times during that 6-year period, and the World Series twice. Roger Maris was one of those players flipped from the Athletics to the Yankees in 1959, and would go on to win back-to-back MVPs and set the single-season home run record in 1961. To add a cherry on top, the stadium in Kansas City required renovations and expansion paid for by the city prior to the Athletics moving in. The contract was awarded to Webb Company, owned by, you guessed it, Del Webb. The winners in the Athletics' relocation to Kansas City was, by far, the New York Yankees. In all of this, Arnold Johnson played Roy Mack like a fiddle. Realizing Roy would change his mind haphazardly to whatever deal looked best for him at the moment, Johnson put all his energy into convincing Roy and promising the world. But Johnson did not trust Roy Mack to stay the course once he decided to sell to Johnson, as he had already flip-flopped his position multiple times in mere weeks. Once the purchase was final, Johnson instructed his lawyer to get the stock out of Roy's name first and do so immediately. Roy's promised executive role within the Kansas City Athletics, one of the carrots on a stick that Johnson promised him, ended up being a ceremonial position as vice president with no real power, voice, or authority within the organization. Roy ended up leaving the Athletics after only 1 year. We would never find out Arnold Johnson's true long-term intentions with the Athletics. Whether he would flip the team after 5 or 6 years, or as some alleged, that the whole plan was to eventually sell to Del Webb in order to move the team to the West Coast, giving Topping and Webb control of 2 American League franchises. Johnson died suddenly in March of 1960 from a cerebral hemorrhage, and Charlie Finley would buy the Athletics from Johnson's estate and then buy out all minority shareholders of the team, cutting all business ties the Athletics had with the Yankees. After no relocations from 1903 to 1952, Major League Baseball saw a team move in 3 consecutive years. The Boston Braves to Milwaukee in 1953, the St. Louis Browns to Baltimore in 1954, and the Philadelphia Athletics to Kansas City in 1955. But the biggest prize of them all, the city that came up as a possibility for nearly every move, the 3rd largest metropolitan area in the United States, was still unclaimed. All eyes now turned to Los Angeles. The 3 relocations we've covered so far are important in Major League Baseball history, but the next 2 teams to move, the New York Giants to San Francisco and the Brooklyn Dodgers to Los Angeles, are on a different level when it comes to magnitude and importance. No slight to the St. Louis Browns, Philadelphia Athletics, and Boston Braves, but if you ask a casual baseball fan to name a player for any of those three teams in the 40s and 50s, as well as the stadium they played in, most are going to struggle. Heck, even seasoned baseball fans would struggle. To prove this point, I asked 11 baseball fans and baseball content creators, including Foolish Baseball, And That's Baseball, Baseball Historian, No More Fielders, Robbie Hyde, The Diamond, Urinating Tree, 5 Point Vids, among others, this exact question. Without looking anything up, name as many St. Louis Browns, Philadelphia Athletics, and Boston Braves as you can that played from 1940 to 1955. And then name as many Brooklyn Dodgers and New York Giants from the same time period. Also, tell me the stadiums each played in. Only one of them was able to name a single Philadelphia Athletic during this time period. And he named 9, show off. 4 weren't able to name any Browns, and 3 weren't able to name a Brave. Most of the Braves named were Hall of Famers that are more well known from their time with the Milwaukee Braves, like Eddie Matthews. Meanwhile, they averaged naming 6 Dodgers and 3 New York Giants. All 11 correctly named Ebbets Field, 10 named the Polo Grounds, while only 5 named Sportsman's Park, 4 named Shibe Park, and only 3 correctly named Braves Field. I think this makes the point that clearly the Brooklyn Dodgers and New York Giants have a greater cultural and historical significance than the other 3 teams. Also, do not challenge Benjamin Christensen of the Hat Club to Immaculate Grid. My God. For the New York Giants, most fans could tell you of Willie Mays and his catch at the Polo Grounds in the 1954 World Series. Heck, the intro to my videos has that catch as the only highlight from before the year 2000. And then there's the city of New York itself, perhaps the baseball capital of the United States over the last 100 years. Yes, a lot of that is dominated by Yankee history, but if you ask anyone what's the biggest baseball city in the US, most people would answer New York, especially from the mid-1940s to the mid-1950s. The 4 most remembered baseball moments during the 1947 to 1956 period all occurred in New York. In 1947, Jackie Robinson played his first game for the Dodgers in Brooklyn. Bobby Thompson hit his famous shot heard round the world, which gave the Giants the 1951 pennant in the Polo Grounds. The park was also the location of Willie Mays' famous catch off the bat of Veeck in the 1954 World Series. Don Larson pitched the only perfect game in World Series history at Yankee Stadium. Thompson's home run and Larson's perfect game both came at the expense of the Dodgers, so those events involved a second New York team as well. Yes, the Browns, Braves, and Athletics relocating were important. But 2 of the most storied teams, located in the biggest city, both moving more than 3,000 miles away in the same year, is something most baseball fans in the mid-1950s would think impossible. So how and why did this happen? First, we need to look at what was happening out on the West Coast. In 1900, San Francisco was the only metropolitan area on the West Coast that was even in the top 30 metro areas by U.S. population. By 1950, Los Angeles was 3rd and San Francisco was 7th. But that wasn't a sudden change. Both cities were top 10 in 1940 and 1930. So why didn't a major league team want to move there earlier, especially when places like Cincinnati and Washington, D.C. were outside the top 10? Just looking at the map, it might seem obvious, but transportation was the primary reason. Prior to 1955, nearly all major league teams traveled exclusively by train. If you look at a map of the American League and National League teams, you'll find a clear dividing line where 4 teams could be considered East Coast and 4 teams could be considered Midwest. Almost every team had the same setup for their schedule. For 75% of the year, they'd either play at home or make short road trips to the 3 other nearby teams. Then 3 times a year, each team would go on a massive 4-city road trip where they'd play the distant 4 teams in their league. For fans, with your home team gone for 3 weeks, many times those road trips were season-defining. If you've ever seen a baseball movie before 1950, you'd almost always see a montage of a train traveling to different cities to represent these long road trips. It's been done so often that even The Simpsons referenced the trope. But even as early as the 30s, commercial air travel began to expand and open up distant parts of the country. It still wasn't at the point where having a West Coast team would be easy, especially with how Major League Baseball teams play nearly every day, but feasible enough that there started to be serious consideration of having a team in California as early as 1940. The St. Louis Browns were dead set on moving to Los Angeles in December of 1941. They had ironed out some of the travel issues and had everything in place. All they needed was approval from the owners in a vote that was expected to pass. The owner meetings were scheduled for the week of December 8th, 1941, where the Browns planned to bring the move to a vote. And just by chance, an event that happened the day before the meetings threw a wrench into the Browns' plans.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
Realizing how difficult it would be to move while the country was involved in a world war, especially since at the time they weren't even sure Major League Baseball would exist during the war, the vote failed 8-0, with even the Browns voting against the move. I want to describe how bonkers the travel schedule would have been for the Browns in 1942 if the move had happened. An article mentions at the time that it would be arranged so each team would only have to fly out one time a year. That means all 7 other teams in the American League would fly out one at a time and play the Browns in an 11-game series. That also means the Browns would be at home for half the season straight and then go on a gigantic 81-game road trip to knock out all their road games at once, which would have been exhausting for the players. I have no idea how they would have done a World Series if the Los Angeles Browns happened to make it. It would have been interesting to see, and baseball history would have been completely different if the move happened, but World War II put the brakes on any consideration of a team moving in the first half of the 1940s. Another barrier to moving out west was the popularity of the Pacific Coast League. While not a major league, although there were a few campaigns throughout the years to make them a third major league, the PCL was just a tier below the American and National Leagues, and well above other minor leagues at the time. And with the PCL fully isolated geographically from the major leagues out east, and with televised sports yet to take off, in fans' minds on the West Coast, the PCL truly was their major league. It may seem laughable today, but had the St. Louis Browns moved to Los Angeles in 1942, they may have struggled to compete with the PCL's Los Angeles Angels in terms of popularity. Arthur Lincoln Mitchell argues that the first major league teams in Los Angeles and San Francisco had to be powerhouse teams like the Dodgers or Giants instead of the lowly Browns, Braves, or Athletics. The quality of West Coast baseball and the loyalties fans held to teams in the PCL in particular made it even more important that the first major league teams in Los Angeles and San Francisco were established teams with well-known and popular players. When the Dodgers and Giants arrived in California, the presence on their rosters of players like Willie Mays, Duke Snider, Pee Wee Reese, and others made it easier to overcome residual loyalty to PCL teams, such as the San Francisco Seals or Los Angeles Angels. But as we got into the 1950s, fortunes began to change for the PCL, ensuring it not only wouldn't be a third major league, but would soon be supplanted by relocating teams from the East. First was the Catch-22. Recognition as a third major league by the American and National Leagues meant they had to play nice with those leagues, meaning agreements in place where major league teams could draft PCL players. Many PCL teams had direct affiliations with major league teams where their star players could get called out east on a moment's notice. This made it so any player that showed significant talent in the PCL soon enough found themselves going to the American or National Leagues. Players like Joe DiMaggio and Ted Williams got their starts in the PCL, but quickly found themselves on the Yankees and Red Sox respectively. This ensured the talent level of the PCL would always remain well below that of the major leagues. Second problem that led to the decline of the PCL was television. In 1953, ABC started broadcasting the MLB Game of the Week. Fans out west could see the major leagues in the comfort of their own home, and it was clear from the broadcast that the talent level was simply higher than that of their local PCL teams. As good as the PCL had always been, by the 1950s, the National and American Leagues were offering a superior product. Television made that conclusion apparent to fans on the West Coast. This gradually weakened perceptions of the quality of baseball in the PCL and undermined enthusiasm for those teams, which was reflected in the declining attendance figures. Focusing on one major contest per week made each game special, offering quality MLB games that eroded local allegiances to minor league teams. The TV Game of the Week coincided with a major transformation of MLB that would bring franchise relocation and then expansion. In 1952, the major leagues did throw the PCL a bone with a path to being recognized as a major league with a system called open classification. But the requirements laid out by Major League Baseball were well beyond what the PCL could accomplish at the time. In order to earn recognition as a major league, the cities representing the PCL were required to have an aggregate population of 15 million. The league's paid attendance had to average 3.5 million over 3 years. The PCL also had to adhere to the Major League minimum salary structure. All league stadiums had to boast a minimum capacity of 25,000. However, there were some benefits from open classification that gave a glimmer of hope that the PCL could reach Major League status. With open classification, the majors extended the period before which a player could be drafted from 4 years to 5, and allowed PCL players to opt out of the draft. The price for players drafted out of the PCL jumped to $15,000. As Oakland Oaks owner Clarence Brick Laws noted, draft relief will be our first step toward becoming a major league. With relief, we can reach major league standards in a few years. At first, draft relief seemed to work. Ahead of the 1952 season, 19 of 20 draft-eligible PCL players opted for contracts that exempted them from being claimed. Fagan observed, "Now we no longer have to serve as a fish hatchery for the majors by developing players for them." Intending to establish its independence of operations, the PCL voted not to take option players starting with the 1953 season, and operating agreements with major league clubs were restricted. With open classification paving a path towards the PCL becoming a third major league, the PCL put out a high-energy promotional film to drum up excitement.
Baseball fans, I am pleased to present to you, through the medium of this film, an inside picture of our Pacific Coast League. We are now in our most important season, for this is the year in which we have declared our intention to become a major league. And this is the year in which we shall seriously go about proving our point. In this great Pacific area where we play, we have approximately 15 million people, more than enough to bring our league up to the peak in baseball. You will no doubt be familiar with many of the names and faces of the players in this film of our spring training, and our clubs are giving you the best in baseball.
Here we have Marvin Owen of Portland. Watch him get that ball to first base with deadly accuracy. He's a real playing manager. He can lead a team, hit and field. And what a great pair of hands he has. This is no easy trick. He can hold 7 baseballs in one hand. If you think this is easy, try it sometime. First, try to get to 7 balls. That's the hard trick.
You have seen our setup for this season. Our parks are being enlarged as quickly as material can be secured. This is big league territory. We have big league fans and big league players and a big league population. Just watch us go.
But the promise of open classification quickly went away as the PCL started to lose attendance. With every club outside of Los Angeles and Hollywood supposedly losing large sums, several clubs planned to sell players to major league clubs to stem the red ink. It was a turn from the potential of open classification. Instead of developing players free from major league draft interference, clubs hawked those players to counter the losses caused by declining fan interest. By 1957, 7 of the 8 PCL clubs had direct affiliations with major league teams. The stadium requirements for open classification were perhaps the most daunting. 0 of the 8 teams met the 25,000 capacity, with Wrigley Field in Los Angeles, where both the Los Angeles Angels and Hollywood Stars played, coming closest with 22,000. Seals Stadium in San Francisco was the second largest, sitting at 18,500. But Lane Field in San Diego, Oak Park in Oakland, Vaughn Street Park in Portland, Sick's Stadium in Seattle, and Edmonds Field in Sacramento all fell well short with only 11 to 12,000 in capacity each. With most of the league already losing money, getting the funds to upgrade all 7 stadiums was difficult, if not downright impossible. Any chance for the PCL to gain recognition as a third major league had disappeared by the mid-1950s, if it even realistically existed to begin with. With that, Los Angeles and San Francisco were wide open for a major league team to relocate. And now we have to look at developments out east. This is Robert Moses, one of the most powerful people in the history of New York. An urban planner that held as many as 12 titles within the New York City government from 1924 to 1975, he was the architect of the city. Any highway, bridge, public housing, or any other public works went through Moses. During his tenure, there were a lot of highways and bridges that went up around the city. You might not think it, but these highways and bridges were a problem for Walter O'Malley and the Dodgers. In the post-war boom, with all these highway projects Robert Moses was putting in place, Dodger fans were moving out to the suburbs and out to Long Island in droves.
But accessible essentially only to the white middle class, who could afford cars. Moses made sure there would be no train to Jones Beach and deliberately built the overpasses on his parkways so low buses had to get there another way.
The first of Moses' commandments for progress is, "Thou shalt drive."
Ebbets Field was located in the middle of the Brooklyn neighborhood of Flatbush. It had 700 total parking spots and limited rail access, so those fans that had moved out to the suburbs had no way of going to Dodger games. Those Brooklyn residents were replaced mostly by immigrants and minorities. Walter O'Malley, a businessman at heart, lamented that these new residents didn't have the money of the previous Brooklyn inhabitants, and therefore didn't go to nearly as many games, and the attendance figures backed him up. Brooklyn Dodger attendance peaked in 1947 at 1.8 million, but in 1955, a World Series winning season for the Dodgers, attendance had dropped 44% down to just over 1 million. He saw the main problem was Ebbets Field and sought finances for a new state-of-the-art stadium, finances that he was able to raise privately. He had the money for a stadium, he just needed the land, which put him at odds with Robert Moses. O'Malley wanted the new stadium at the intersection of Flatbush and Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn, where the Barclays Center sits today. The location was perfect for his needs, the intersection of two main roads in Brooklyn, and most importantly, the location of the terminus station for the Long Island Railroad. But Moses had his own idea where to put a stadium, in Flushing, which would later be the location of the 1964 World's Fair, Shea Stadium, and currently the location of Citi Field. O'Malley tried to plead his case to Moses, but Moses had made up his mind and seemed disinterested, almost annoyed at O'Malley. When it came to land in New York City in 1957, Moses held all the cards. There was really nothing O'Malley could do to get his desired location, and as a stubborn, prideful businessman, Flushing was out of the question, and even considering that location would be admitting defeat. O'Malley searched for a bargaining chip against Robert Moses, and he found it in Los Angeles.
Ebbets Field was an old ballpark. Structurally, it was falling apart. And the public was traveling in automobiles at that time, just starting in. And we could only park 700 cars. Imagine parking 700 cars here. The day will come when we'll have to tear Ebbets Field down, and we'll have to build a new ballpark. I wanted to do it at Atlantic and Flatbush Avenue, which would have been a great site because all the subway lines converged there, Long Island Railroad, and it would have been quite great. But Bob Moses had other ideas. He wanted to put us in Flushing. So I said, well, if we have to be the Flushing Dodgers, I'd just soon be the Los Angeles Dodgers.
Whether O'Malley began discussions with LA as a way to pressure Moses into giving him the land he so desperately wanted in Brooklyn, or whether it started as legitimate discussion for relocation, once it was clear Moses wasn't going to budge, even with the threat of the Dodgers moving to Los Angeles, O'Malley began putting together a concrete plan. O'Malley saw what was going on in Milwaukee. After the Braves had left Boston, the Milwaukee Braves led all of Major League Baseball in attendance from 1953 to 1957. Milwaukee County Stadium was located next to a highway with ample on-site parking. Los Angeles was 5 times larger than Milwaukee, and it was clear getting a similar stadium near a highway with ample on-site parking would be a gold mine. During a trip to LA while scouting for locations by helicopter, O'Malley spotted Chavez Ravine and identified it as the perfect spot for a new ballpark, and the city was more than willing to make it available for him. On top of taking care of the stadium, O'Malley had also been testing out the feasibility of air travel for a baseball team. The Dodgers bought a 5-seat twin-engine Beechcraft in 1948, used primarily for team general manager Branch Rickey and Walter O'Malley himself. Impressed by how the aircraft turned what would normally be day-long train trips into hour-long flights, O'Malley thought maybe it would be possible to get a bigger plane to transport the team. After purchasing an abandoned World War II naval air base in Vero Beach from businessman Bud Holman, O'Malley mentioned to him the desire to get a larger aircraft. Holman was a representative for Eastern Airlines, who were phasing out their fleet of DC-3s at the time, and told O'Malley he could get him his aircraft. A few days later, Holman presented O'Malley with a 20-seat DC-3 that he said he won in a craps game. Needing 2 trips to transport a whole baseball team, the DC-3 originally was only used during spring training for VIPs and sponsors. But in 1954, the Dodgers decided to try out the plane for transporting one of their minor league teams for an entire season, 2 trips in all, to see if there would be maintenance problems, weather problems, or other issues that would be barriers to air travel at the major league level. For the 1954 season, the St. Paul Saints of the American Association traveled in style. It was such a success that they added the Fort Worth Cats for the 1955 season. Harry Holman, Bud Holman's son, was the pilot for all of these trips. He said of the arrangement, "We flew St. Paul all year, and then they would throw in the Fort Worth, Texas club. I flew St. Paul on every trip, but when they were staying home, I'd run down and fly Fort Worth and run them around for a couple weeks." That was in 1954 to 1956. With testing out of the way, O'Malley looked to upgrade to a large enough plane that could transport the entire major league team, and in January of 1957 bought a Convair 440 Metropolitan for $700,000, and the Brooklyn Dodgers traveled by plane the 1957 season. As a sign of things to come, at the end of the season, Holman was flying Dodger officials and some select players to Los Angeles. Even though the move to Los Angeles wasn't official and no paperwork had been signed, Holman got a sign painter to replace Brooklyn with Los Angeles on the side of the plane. I wasn't supposed to know they were moving, but I did. I went up to New York from Vero Beach to the Eastern Gate at LaGuardia to pick up Mr. O'Malley and all the directors and everybody. Of course, my dad went from Vero. The day before I went up there, I got a sign painter to come out and we painted out Brooklyn and put Los Angeles on the Convair. When we arrived in LA, those who greeted us were surprised too, because here was the airplane that already said Los Angeles. They really hadn't made the official announcement. My dad told me. That was my idea. My dad and Walter were a little bit mad at me about putting that Los Angeles on the side, said Holman. I think they hadn't really signed any contracts at the time. But there was still one big problem for O'Malley to truly finalize the move. It was thought by the league that to move a team that far out west would need to be done in pairs. O'Malley would have to convince a second team to move to California with the Dodgers. He didn't have to look far. For all the problems the Dodgers had with their stadium, neighborhood demographics, and attendance, it was even worse for the New York Giants and their owner Horace Stoneham. The Dodgers were at least still making money in Brooklyn, even if it wasn't as much in the 50s as it was in the 40s. But the Giants weren't even managing that. Just like the Dodgers, the Giants also hit their high in attendance in 1947 with 1.6 million, but in 1957 were down to 650,000. In 1954, when the Giants won the World Series, their attendance was half that of the Milwaukee Braves. The Polo Grounds was a dilapidated stadium that was in even worse shape than Ebbets Field. The problems got even worse when the New York Giants football team moved their games from the Polo Grounds to Yankee Stadium, depriving Stoneham of rent money the football Giants were paying him. Stoneham had to get his team out of the Polo Grounds. He even looked into having the Giants play their home games at Yankee Stadium across the Harlem River, but that never materialized. To add fuel to the fire, Robert Moses wrote a letter to Stoneham in 1953 suggesting the Giants leave the Polo Grounds to make room for public housing in northern Manhattan. More so than the Dodgers, the writing was on the wall that the Giants were going to move. Similar to how the Boston Braves owned the territorial rights to Milwaukee due to owning the minor league team there, the New York Giants owned the territorial rights to Minneapolis through owning the minor league Minneapolis Millers. And similar to Milwaukee, Minneapolis had just built a brand new stadium, Metropolitan Stadium, in 1956, with the hopes of attracting a major league team. The Giants now seemed like the obvious team to move into Minneapolis's new stadium. Stoneham had a private conversation with Walter O'Malley, stating his intentions to move to Minneapolis. O'Malley wrote in his personal records, "Mr. Stoneham made up his mind some time ago to move his franchise from New York to Minneapolis." Walter O'Malley realized this was his chance to get another team to move out west with the Dodgers. I asked Mr. Stoneham if he had considered San Francisco. O'Malley had San Francisco Mayor George Christopher meet with Stoneham, and Stoneham was given an offer he couldn't pass up. A new stadium with ample parking and the promise of an enthusiastic fan base waiting for big league baseball. Weighing his options over the summer, Stoneham decided to forsake Minneapolis in favor of what he thought was a better market with more economic advantages. In August, once he had received an official letter of invitation from the city of San Francisco, Stoneham agreed to move to California for the 1958 season.
At a meeting of our board today, they voted permission for us to transfer the New York Giants franchise to San Francisco.
Does that mean you will definitely do it?
That's right.
How soon will these plans take effect, Horace?
Well, right now, one of the newspapermen has the letter of intent there, and I just spoke to the mayor of San Francisco, but I wasn't first. Somebody called him from here.
Will you still be known as the Giants?
That's right.
Where will you play in San Francisco?
The immediate plans are to start the season, or most of the season, in Seal Stadium. The mayor told me that he and Mr. Paul Fagan have discussed it, and Mr. Fagan is very cooperative.
Stoneham, do you have any statement to make to the Giant fans of New York?
Oh, we're very sorry that we're leaving here, naturally. I'm very sentimental about the Giants and about New York City, but conditions were such that our move would have to be immediately, otherwise we'd probably not be able to move into another city under such good conditions.
Bill Veeck wrote of this. O'Malley not only got him better territory, but he did all the preliminary work for him in San Francisco, thereby permitting Horace to slip out of New York without even a bad press. Just 7 weeks after Stoneham announced the Giants moving to San Francisco, the Brooklyn Dodgers announced their move to Los Angeles. Both moves were official, and there would just be one team in New York in 1958 and two teams in California. But there were still some issues to iron out on the West Coast. Both the Dodgers and Giants, with stadium deals tentatively in place in Los Angeles and San Francisco respectively, announced their intentions to move after the 1957 season. But those stadium deals weren't as straightforward as they looked on paper. Neither stadium promised to the teams would be ready in 1958, making it so both teams had to find temporary places to play in the meantime, with the Dodgers playing in the spacious, but not ideal for baseball, Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum, and the Giants taking over the made-for-baseball but not very spacious Seal Stadium, where the PCL San Francisco Seals had played for 27 years. The Giants were in luck though. San Francisco had an area called Candlestick Point, an area close to the airport and near two main highways that was a shipbuilding hub during World War II. But with the war ending more than a decade earlier, the demand for shipbuilding had decreased sharply. With no residents needing to be displaced to make room, getting approval for a stadium at Candlestick Point was relatively easy. In August of 1958, the community saw an opportunity to grow it hadn't seen in over a decade. The construction of a new stadium for the San Francisco Giants baseball team right in the Bayview Hunters Point community. The park, which was initially designed to hold 43,000 spectators, injected life into a community that had begun to struggle with employment following the downturn of the slaughterhouse and shipbuilding industries. On April 12, 1960, Candlestick Park opened its gates, and with it came the hope that the stadium would lead to more jobs and development in the area around the stadium. The Dodgers would not have as easy of a time to get final approval for their stadium. Chavez Ravine, the site O'Malley picked out by helicopter during a tour of Los Angeles, had some complicated history. It was located on the edge of the Los Angeles downtown area, and Los Angeles authorities decided in 1950 to use federal money from the Federal Housing Act of 1949 to turn Chavez Ravine into public housing. The problem was Chavez Ravine was the site of around 1,000 predominantly Mexican-American households, and the city had to get rid of those houses and the people to be able to put in the 36,000 low-income apartments they were planning. The city at first offered to buy the land from the residents, but the residents that accepted soon found that what the city was offering was not anywhere close to what the land was worth.
My dad made a mistake. You know, the guys from the city came and knocked on the door, and they offered him $9,600. So my dad said, wow, you know, I really made some money, you know, I made a killing. That's what he thought. So when we moved out of there, and my dad had to buy another house, they were $9,600. They were $15,000, $17,000, $18,000.
Additionally, residents were promised through letters that once the government housing was in place, named Elysian Park Heights, they would be at the top of the list and could move back into Chavez Ravine. The letters explained the city's plan and not only assured residents that if they were eligible for public housing, they would not only have top priority to move into any Los Angeles public housing development, but promised once the new development was completed, they would have the first chance to move back into the Elysian Park Heights development. To the many families for whom the area had long been a community, it was nevertheless a crushing and still unexpected blow, especially given the reality that since most of the area residents were undocumented, they did not meet the eligibility requirements for residency in the new project. Ignoring that trading out a house with a yard and plenty of space for an apartment is a raw deal to begin with, those promises in the letter were not kept, and all due to a senator in Wisconsin named Joe McCarthy. The Red Scare and McCarthyism were in full swing in the early 1950s, where anything resembling communism or socialism had to be stamped out, including blacklisting of Hollywood actors and writers, loyalty oaths required at universities, and, most importantly for Chavez Ravine, kicking out government workers with a history with communist or socialist beliefs. Los Angeles city planner Frank Wilkinson, the person spearheading government housing projects in the city, was one such person.
One of the top communist agents assigned to Operation Abolition is Frank Wilkinson, recently convicted for contempt of Congress for refusal to answer questions concerning his Communist Party membership and activities.
I was fired. I'm out. Destroyed. Really destroyed.
Not only was Wilkinson fired from his job, but his public housing projects were labeled as counter to capitalist principles and un-American, and the Chavez Ravine development was canceled. With the project dead, the federally owned land was sold to the city of Los Angeles at a massive discount, with the only stipulation being that the land be used for public purposes. At this point, the city of Los Angeles had already evicted and bought out more than 90% of the residents for seemingly no reason. By 1957, only 20 families remained on the land. When Walter O'Malley had his helicopter tour of Los Angeles scouting out locations for a ballpark, what looked like an undeveloped ghost town with plenty of land right near a highway development seemed like an obvious choice. And the city had no problem promising the land to O'Malley, conveniently ignoring the federal stipulation that the land had to be used for public purposes. Giving that land to a private businessman for a stadium for his private business would seemingly not be public use. The first hurdle was a citywide vote on Proposition B, which would be on the June 3, 1958 ballot. A yes vote meant that the contract with the Dodgers and the city would be approved, while a no vote meant the previously signed city contract would be rejected. O'Malley pulled out all the stops with a public campaign to vote yes on Prop B. On June 1st, 2 days before the election, a 5-hour telethon was held in support of Prop B, including appearances by many celebrities including Ronald Reagan, Jerry Lewis, Joe E. Brown, George Burns, Jack Benny, Debbie Reynolds, and over a dozen more actors, musicians, and professional athletes. Even with this strong campaign, Proposition B barely passed, with 345,435 votes for yes to 321,142 votes for no. But that wasn't the end. It would still have to go to the courts to see if Proposition B was even legal, since it violated the public use clause. While the Los Angeles Superior Court agreed that a stadium for the Dodgers wasn't public use, and the city couldn't change the public purpose clause tied to the land, in January 1959, the California Supreme Court unanimously overturned that ruling, clearing any legal barriers for O'Malley to acquire the land. On May 9, 1959, the last residents of Chavez Ravine were evicted by force. Dodger Stadium would be completed and would be the permanent home of the Los Angeles Dodgers just 3 years later in April of 1962. When I first started making this video, I mapped out every relocation and expansion team during the 20-year period in question. One weird thing that stood out to me: in 1961, the Washington Senators relocated to Minneapolis. But also in 1961, an expansion franchise was put in Washington to be called the Washington Senators. This doesn't make sense. Of the 5 moves we've covered so far, all have been framed as the team's current and future financial situation wasn't viable for the city they were in. If the same were true for the Washington Senators, prompting their move to Minneapolis, why would there immediately be an expansion team put into the same situation? Also, why move a team and then expand into the city they just vacated? Why not just have an expansion team in Minneapolis and have the current Washington Senators stay put? The reason is a complicated web of stakeholders, motives, and political pressure. And it all starts with New York Mayor Robert Wagner. Wagner was not too happy that New York City, the largest city in the country, his city, was down to one team after the Dodgers and Giants left for the West Coast.
Mayor Wagner, how many cities in the United States do you feel can support two Major League Baseball teams?
Well, I suppose there are only a few of them, but I'm confident that New York is one.
While it was questionable if New York could support three teams at the same time, nobody questioned the city's ability to support two. And Wagner made it his mission to get a second team back into the city, specifically a National League team.
What is New York doing now about getting a second Major League Baseball team?
Well, I have four very prominent citizens here in New York City working to bring another Major League team in the National League to New York City. And our city government here has informed everyone in the United States, including the National League, that we will build a stadium for them at no expense.
He created a committee to do so and put William Shea in charge. Shea was faced with three options to get a second Major League club in New York: relocate an already existing team, push for Major League expansion and get one of those expansion teams, or option number 3, which we'll get into in a minute. Relocation hit a dead end pretty quickly. With all of the undersized multi-team cities already taken care of in the mid-1950s, there was no team itching to relocate. Shea sent out feelers to Pittsburgh and Cincinnati, but neither team wanted to move. Getting an expansion team also hit a snag. NL President Warren Giles publicly stated the league had no plans to expand. If Shea was going to make any progress, he'd have to force the league's hand. And that's where we get to option 3. Create an entirely new third league. The American League and National League really had no reason to recognize a third league, so this seemed like a Hail Mary play by Shea, but there was some political pressure coming from Washington. First was Representative Emanuel Seller. He was from New York's 11th District, which covered Queens and Brooklyn, which meant he was aligned with Wagner and Shea's goal to get a second New York baseball team at any cost. When a politician in Washington, D.C. wants Major League Baseball to do something, you hit them where it hurts, and you go after the league's antitrust exemption. MLB's antitrust exemption originated from a 1922 Supreme Court ruling in Federal Baseball Club versus National League. What this ruling did was grant MLB a monopoly. Essentially, the federal government said, this is the main baseball league in the United States, and there will be no competitors. This gave Major League Baseball territorial control over cities, control over the rights to players, and made it so other upstart leagues couldn't become a major league without Major League Baseball's say-so. It's a reason the Pacific Coast League had to play ball with Major League Baseball when they made their push to become a third major league, and ultimately why they failed. Emanuel Seller introduced legislation into the House to remove this exemption in 1958, but didn't really garner a lot of support, and ultimately the bill was buried in the Senate. But in 1959, Shea found an ally in the Senate with Tennessee Senator Estes Kefauver. Kefauver was chairman of the Antitrust and Monopoly Subcommittee, and, to the horror of Major League Baseball's owners, was a true believer of antitrust. Kefauver believed that Major League Baseball shouldn't have the monopoly that the Supreme Court granted them in 1922. In 1959, Kefauver introduced legislation in the Senate to remove antitrust exemptions from all professional sports leagues, including limiting Major League teams to controlling just 80 players. At the time, through minor league affiliates, some teams had control of over 400 players. A bill like this passing would be the worst case scenario for all of the Major League Baseball owners. While all of this was going on, Shea found the perfect person to spearhead the third league. Branch Rickey, legendary baseball executive, put his hat in the arena and formed what would be known as the Continental League. Initially with 5 teams and owners: Joan Whitney Payson in New York, Craig Cullinan Jr. in Houston, Wheelock Whitney Jr. in Minneapolis, Bob Howsam in Denver, and Jack Kent Cooke in Toronto, and quickly up to 8 teams with additional franchises in Atlanta, Dallas, and Buffalo. Rickey's goal was to get this Continental League established as a third major league, and instead of a 2-league World Series, have a round robin between the 3 leagues to determine a world champion. Rickey announced the inaugural season of the Continental League would be in 1961. Here's a good time to step back and look at what everyone wants, and what they want to avoid. There's the New York contingent. They want a second team in New York City. That's their only goal. There's Branch Rickey, who wants the Continental League to thrive and become the third major league. There's the Continental League owners, who you would think would have the same goal as Rickey, but this wasn't the case. Each one of those owners wanted, simply, to have a Major League franchise in their city that they own. If this was through the Continental League, great. But if Major League Baseball came to one of them individually and said, we're gonna put an expansion team in your city and make you the owner, they would ditch the Continental League in an instant. Because of that, none of these owners wanted to upset Major League Baseball. If they were aggressive on the idea of the Continental League, and the Continental League failed, and then Major League Baseball decided to expand to their city, they would be on the outside looking in. This conflict in goals between the Continental League owners and Branch Rickey would eventually lead to the downfall of the league. And then there's Major League Baseball themselves. Yes, there was Commissioner Ford Frick and American League and National League presidents Joe Cronin and Warren Giles, but if you've been paying attention in this video so far, you'll know that the people that really held the power and made the decisions for each league were the owners of the most powerful teams. Del Webb of the Yankees for the American League and Walter O'Malley of the Dodgers for the National League. The biggest priority for the owners was not to lose their antitrust exemption. That's a scenario they wanted to avoid at all costs, and there was a legitimate chance that Kefauver's bill could pass. The owners wanted to keep the senators in Washington happy. Therefore, it was the owners' interest to keep the possibility of both the Continental League becoming a third league and MLB expansion on the table. A senator from, let's say, Texas is less likely to vote against the league if it looks like there's something in the works for a major league team to land in Houston. This meant that Major League Baseball would have to play nice with the Continental League, at least temporarily. If there wasn't this pressure from Washington, it's possible they would have completely ignored the Continental League or actively sabotaged it. Instead, they met with Branch Rickey and his owners and established requirements to get recognition as a third major league. They would need 8 teams, with all 8 cities larger than the smallest current MLB city, which was Kansas City with a population of 450,000. All teams with a stadium with at least 25,000 capacity, and every team would have to reach a financial settlement with whatever minor league team currently existed in that city. With all of this going on, and everyone trying to play nice with each other while also pursuing their goals, Calvin Griffith, owner of the Washington Senators, threw a wrench in the works by announcing he intended to move his team out of Washington to Minneapolis. It's comical how on the nose this is. Major League Baseball wants to appease senators in Washington to avoid losing their antitrust exemption, and Calvin Griffith is going rogue, moving a team literally called the Senators out of Washington. In a panic, the American League created a committee to look at expansion. Branch Rickey, realizing expansion would nuke the Continental League's chances of becoming a third league, brought up the idea to his owners of the Continental League, going outlaw and raiding the minor leagues of talent. But this is when he found out his Continental League owners weren't on the same page. They hear MLB is considering expansion, they think they could be one of the owners of an expansion team. Going rogue and angering Major League Baseball is the last thing they want to do. Meanwhile, Kefauver's bill was up for a vote in the Senate. While it failed, it was close with a vote of 45 to 41. 3 senators flip and Major League Baseball could say goodbye to their antitrust exemption. MLB was scared and set up an emergency meeting with the Continental League on August 2, 1960, only 8 months before the Continental League would have their first game, and came to a compromise. Major League Baseball would expand by 8 teams, 4 now and 4 later. And those 8 teams would be the 8 Continental League franchises. The Continental League owners were ecstatic and immediately agreed to the deal, canceled the plans for the Continental League to begin operations in 1961, and in an instant, the league folded. Here's the problem with that. The 4 now, 4 later plan wasn't a binding agreement, and the only leverage the Continental League had was that they existed and were about to start operations. The second they canceled the season and folded their league, their leverage was gone. If MLB announced an expansion team that wasn't a Continental League franchise, what are they going to do? Reform the Continental League after they just showed they had no backbone? In order to have any chance of success, the Continental League needed 8 owners committed to the Continental League, and that wasn't the case. We've talked about Major League Baseball's motivations as a whole, but there was also some competition between the 2 leagues, and this came out when determining the 4 expansion franchises. As we've already mentioned, Washington, D.C. would have to be one of them. But there were only so many possible locations for an expansion team, with some cities looking more financially lucrative than others, and the American League and National League were jockeying for those better cities. Walter O'Malley was able to coordinate the National League to beat the American League to the punch, getting an agreement on October 17th to have expansion teams in New York and in Houston for the 1962 season, just 2 months after both leagues agreed to the 4 now and 4 later deal with the Continental League. Houston was the prized possession that both leagues wanted, and the National League just moved faster to make it official, which angered Del Webb and the American League. The American League now had to figure out where their 2 expansion teams would be. If they followed the agreement with the Continental League, it would be either Atlanta, Dallas, Denver, Toronto, or Buffalo. But now there was no need to follow that agreement. New York had gotten their expansion team, so there was no motivation for Shea to continue to back the Continental League. The American League's hands were untied, and they could put an expansion team anywhere. Webb, angry about the National League announcing their expansion team so early, looked to get back at Walter O'Malley for snatching up Houston. The one thing O'Malley didn't want is a second franchise in Los Angeles to compete for fans with his Dodgers. So that's exactly what Del Webb and the American League did, declaring the Los Angeles Angels as their first expansion team. Although Walter O'Malley did get a bit of revenge for the American League encroaching on his territory, which Bill Veeck, now owner of the American League Chicago White Sox, described. As we met to vote for the Los Angeles franchise, we discovered that Walter O'Malley was loaded down with objections about anybody coming into his private grazing ground in Los Angeles. We discovered it when Ford Frick, that erstwhile apostle of the open city, sent word from his office that some kind of fair and equitable settlement had to be made with O'Malley. Before we could grant permission for an American League team to come into the open city of Los Angeles, O'Malley insisted on naming who the owners would be, where they would play, and how much television they could use. Oh yes, he also wanted indemnities to the amount of $350,000. His demands about the park were, I thought, most outrageous. The new team, said O'Malley, had to play its first season in Wrigley Field, no place else, and also had to sign a contract to come into his own park at Chavez Ravine as his tenant as soon as it was ready. In a last attempt to save some shred of dignity, I called a quick caucus to try to get our league to at least protect Autry, who is Gene Autry, the now approved owner of the new franchise, from being stuck in Wrigley Field in the event O'Malley didn't have his park finished on schedule. I couldn't even get that. The vote was 6-2, with only Cleveland and Chicago voting against accepting O'Malley's terms. The American League still had one obligation to fill with their expansion team: appeasing politicians in Washington. So their second expansion team would be the Washington Senators to replace Griffith's Senators that had moved to Minneapolis. Neither American League expansion team was from a Continental League city. The 4 now, 4 later plan that Major League Baseball had agreed to with the Continental League evaporated the moment the Continental League canceled operations. The lasting legacy of the Continental League is it motivated Major League Baseball to expand for the first time. And the answer to the initial question of this chapter, why have one of those first expansion teams be in Washington, D.C. when Calvin Griffith just moved the Senators out of D.C., that was a reaction to how close the vote was in the Senate. But the Senators left Minnesota because D.C. wasn't working out financially for Calvin Griffith. Would these new Washington Senators be able to succeed? Unsurprisingly, we'll revisit Washington later in this video.
This evening is a subject that is quite dear to my heart. It's the rape of Milwaukee. It's a frightening example of the monstrous cynicism of baseball operations. And we invited some gentlemen on both sides of the question as to whether baseball has the right, and particularly the National League has the right, to desert the town of Milwaukee and move to Atlanta. And then if they have the right to ignore the decisions and orders of the court, setting themselves above the law of the land. And we'll examine it in some detail and probably with some heat.
The first move we covered in this video, the Boston Braves to Milwaukee, was arguably the most successful franchise relocation out the gate in baseball history. From 1953 to 1960, the Milwaukee Braves were the most successful team, at least financially, in Major League Baseball. Their attendance, which was the primary source of revenue for teams in the 50s, lapped the rest of the league. Over 3 million above the most popular team in the biggest market that went to 5 World Series in those 8 years, the New York Yankees, and more than double 7 other teams, triple the Washington Senators. The Braves were a cultural movement in Milwaukee that peaked with their 1957 World Series win and 1958 World Series appearance. But that turned on its head almost as fast. While first in attendance by far from 1953 to 1960, from 1961 to 1965, they had fallen to 12th among the original 16 franchises. After the 1965 season, the Milwaukee Braves moved to Atlanta. What happened? How could a team generate such excitement and deliver on that excitement with a World Series win in their first 8 years in the city, but then just 5 years later hit the point where they have to leave town? There were certainly some external factors. The Washington Senators moving to Minneapolis and becoming the Twins took a slice out of Milwaukee's territory. The rise of the Green Bay Packers under Vince Lombardi, who in the 60s won 5 NFL championships, became the most popular sports team in Wisconsin, and also played 3 home games a year in Milwaukee. A decrease in Milwaukee's population in the 60s as people started moving out to the suburbs. Milwaukee's population actually peaked exactly in 1960. The Braves drop in the standings as they finished first or second in the National League in 7 of their first 8 years, but after 1960 their highest finish was 4th. But even with that drop in the standings, they never had a losing season. All of those things played a role, but certainly not enough to kill a successful franchise in just 5 years. Plenty of other major league teams have seen lulls in performance or attendance for much longer periods of time, but weren't forced to relocate. Something else had to be going on for this to happen. In my mind, the primary culprit that led to relocation was the failure of ownership through a number of errors and missteps. The first error was Lou Perini's misunderstanding of the growing importance of television. Prioritizing in-person attendance, Perini refused to allow any Braves home or road games to be broadcast on television. While in-person attendance was the primary source of revenue for teams at the time, television was growing throughout the 50s and 60s and would be an important tool in growing any team's fan base. Ted Turner, who bought the Atlanta Braves in 1976, is perhaps the best example of this. A television producer, Turner put the Braves on the channel he owned, which turned into the nationally broadcasted TBS in 1979, making it so every Braves game was nationally televised. There are Braves fans to this day all over the country that only became fans because they could watch the team every night throughout the 80s and 90s. Even fans that aren't anywhere near Atlanta. Perini denying Milwaukee Braves fans the ability to see their team on TV, especially during road trips, severely hurt the growth and enthusiasm of the fan base. Second error was Perini further trying to maximize in-stadium profits by banning carry-in beer to the stadium in 1961. I don't know if you've ever been to a Milwaukee tailgate or understand beer culture in Milwaukee, but drinking and baseball go hand in hand in Wisconsin, and banning carry-ins caused a fan revolt. 1961 saw a massive drop in attendance as fans just decided to stay at home rather than pay inflated beer prices at the ballpark. Perini walked this back, allowing carry-ins for 1962, but the damage had already been done. The third error Perini made with Wisconsin fans was transferring ownership of the Braves from himself to his construction company, Perini Corporation. Wanting to raise capital, Perini Corporation got approval to go public in 1961, offering stock to the public, which was advertised to Milwaukee fans as a chance to personally own a piece of the Braves. Sold at $13 a share, lots of fans jumped at the chance to buy the stock. Within 6 months, the stock had decreased to $3, a 77% loss. Fans that had decided to buy a piece of the Braves had just lost most of their money. This massive drop was because Perini Corporation was doing terribly financially. Lou Perini's business was expecting a massive financial loss in 1962, and he was looking for a solution. What he needed was a big influx of cash to offset the losses on the books. He had just rolled the Braves up into his corporation, and the easiest way to get that influx was to sell the Braves, which he decided to do. Error number 4 by Perini was once he put the Braves on the market, there were a number of Milwaukee businessmen that created a syndicate to bid for the Braves, including Bud Selig and Edmund Fitzgerald Jr., but Perini sold to a Chicago syndicate led by William Bartholomew, a syndicate that had bought and quickly sold part of the White Sox just 2 years prior. If you don't know anything about Milwaukee and Chicago, selling a Milwaukee team to businessmen in Chicago that were viewed as suits just in it for the money was not a way to endear fans to the team. Fans viewed this new ownership with heavy skepticism. As a side note, remember in St. Louis when the Cardinals were sold to Gussie Busch, owner of Anheuser-Busch, which guaranteed the Cardinals would stay in St. Louis, and Bill Veeck gave up on his campaign to kick the Cardinals out of town? A similar thing almost happened in Milwaukee. Fred Miller, president of Miller Brewing Company, was instrumental back in 1952 in convincing Milwaukee to build a new stadium to attract a major league team. A Milwaukee man through and through that loved baseball, he would have been the ideal person to purchase the Braves from Perini. Unfortunately, he died in a plane crash in 1954. Milwaukee Braves historian Bob Buge said if Fred Miller had not died in a plane crash on December 17, 1954, he would have put together an ownership group in Milwaukee to buy the club from Perini. Bill Bartholomew himself even agrees, saying, frankly, if Fred Miller hadn't died in that tragic accident, he would have been the perfect guy to keep the Braves in Milwaukee. He was one of the most wonderful people in Milwaukee at the time. Error number 5 was the Chicago syndicate bought the team under financial terms that set them up for failure. Bill Veeck went into details. The total cost of the purchase came to $6,218,480 to pay for the club. They were able to borrow $3 million from the First Wisconsin National Bank on behalf of the club, $900,000 from the Marshall and Ilse Bank on a 120-day note, sold back 15.4% of the stock to the Perini Corporation for $310,000. When everything shakes out, we find that the Carpetbaggers, this was the nickname for the Chicago syndicate in the Milwaukee press, had a personal investment of $1.7 million. But the Carpetbaggers' financing has another twist. The 120-day note was due May 1st, 1963. Our boys would still have to go out and borrow another $900,000 on their own names. Additionally, the $3 million loan from First Wisconsin National Bank required a $500,000 payment in 1966, a $500,000 payment in 1967, and a $2 million balloon payment in 1968. The Braves would have to generate incredible profits in just 6 years to make all these payments. To make that 120-day note payment in 1963, they bought the Braves with the plan to sell team stock to Milwaukee fans. Fans that had just bought stock in Perini Corporation 2 years earlier to have a chance to own the Braves and lost almost all their money. The public prospectus for the stock being offered also mentioned that shareholders would not see any return on their investment until the loans the Chicago syndicate used to buy the team would be paid off, which would take years.
In 1963, a few months after they bought the club, they put 115,000 shares of stock on the open market at $11.38. to residents of the state of Wisconsin.
When they opened their sale, they prepared a prospectus.
Yes, they did.
And in this prospectus, among other things, it said that don't look for any return on your money for some period of years.
By their bank loan, they couldn't have a return on your money. They had to pay off their entire bank loan bill before there could be any dividends declared on any of their stock. But there were two other factors, Bill. Number one, the Perini Corporation had offered stock approximately a year and a half before that, and of course at that time in the Perini Corporation were the Milwaukee Braves baseball club, which incidentally created quite a bit of excitement in Wisconsin, because after all this gave a chance for people to buy a baseball team, even if by second hand. The stock sold at $12 a share, and I think some months later, not much, maybe 6 months later, it was down to $3 a share. So I think there had been a certain disenchantment there. And the other reason, I think that the Chicago group should have recognized from their experience on the White Sox that for people to come in, Bob Eline and Ed Fitzgerald and Dan Parker and Dwayne Bowman and people like that.
Those, incidentally, to people who don't know Milwaukee as well as I, are names to conjure with in Milwaukee because they represent the greatest amount of stability in a very stable area.
And these people who were thrilled to become part of the Milwaukee Brewers bill because they were one of the 10 people who were going to actively own this corporation, but in the Braves case, they were buying stock in the operating company, which was owned by the holding company. And again, so therefore there was absolutely no appeal at all for a man to invest a large sum of money in something he had absolutely no control over.
Then wouldn't want to buy any great number of shares, would they?
The new stock sale failed spectacularly, selling only $136,000 of stock, well short of their $1.3 million goal. A stipulation of the stock sale was any unsold stock would have to be purchased by Bartholomew and his group, meaning they had to immediately borrow another $1 million to buy the stock, and then use that money from the sale to make the 120-day note payment. They were taking out loans to pay off loans, not a sound financial decision. And because it was the fans that didn't bail them out of their bad decision by buying the stock, the Chicago group was able to place the blame on the city. The stock issue laid such a bomb that it should have been obvious to the carpetbaggers that it had not been a very bright idea from the beginning. It seemed to convince them instead that Milwaukee was no longer interested in supporting the big league team. It's quite possible that the carpetbaggers turned their shiny eyes towards Atlanta the next morning. Error number 6 was once the stock sale failed, Bartholomew's ownership group looked to move the team to Atlanta, and word got out in the Milwaukee press, further angering Milwaukee fans and creating an even bigger slide in attendance.
Then they went shopping. Cleon, when did you first learn of their attempt to move?
Well, if you mean the rumors that first came out, that, of course, was as early as 1964 and perhaps 1963, depending on how much you wanted to believe some of the things that you heard.
Was there some reason to believe that there had been some preliminary meetings in July of '63?
I think so. I couldn't spot the place or just who was there, but in view of subsequent events, there doesn't seem to be much doubt that there was some informal discussion.
At the conclusion of the 1963 season, Braves general manager John McHale tried to play down the rumors, stating, "The Braves will be in Milwaukee today, tomorrow, next year, and as long as we are welcome." Bartholomew said in 1964, "We're not going elsewhere no matter what you hear. I think the day of transferring franchises is pretty well over." But those assurances did little to persuade Milwaukee fans, especially with what was going on in the background. As the season progressed, it became apparent that while the Braves might not be going anywhere, some of their property was. The Braves shipped some of their concession books down to Atlanta. Simultaneously, their own items at County Stadium began to carry the neat and simple word Braves instead of the complex and vulgar Milwaukee Braves. The scoreboard for the Atlanta Stadium, it was learned, was being decorated with Brave emblems, and the mayor of Atlanta had offered the contractor a $700,000 bonus to have the park ready by opening day of 1965. The Braves announced they would move to Atlanta after the 1964 season.
The board of directors of the Milwaukee Braves Incorporated voted today to request permission of the National League to transfer their franchise to Atlanta, Georgia for 1965.
However, the Braves did not move for 1965 because the lease for Milwaukee County Stadium contractually obliged the team to play their home games in Milwaukee.
They did try to move, didn't they? Well, they already had an existing contract.
Oh, yes, they were denied the right to do that.
And the court stopped them from moving with the existing contract.
The District Federal Court in Milwaukee stopped it, yes.
So that they didn't really pay much attention to contractual obligations in this particular area.
No, and then within a week after the court had told them they could not move, the National League got together and said, well, you can't move.
The lease would end after the 1965 season, making that year a lame duck year in the eyes of fans, and attendance cratered to the lowest in Milwaukee Braves history. However, the fight was not done for the city of Milwaukee and would still go to the courts to prevent a move in 1966. Wisconsin Attorney General Bronson LaFollette wanted to keep the Braves in the state. And when a politician wants to pressure Major League Baseball into doing something, you go to the tried and true tactic of going after the league's antitrust exemption. LaFollette sued the National League and the Braves in Wisconsin court for antitrust and monopolistic practices. The big difference from previous suits against Major League Baseball, which were all in federal court and consistently ruled in MLB's favor, was this suit would be at the state level under Wisconsin antitrust laws. With the deck stacked against them in Wisconsin court, the Braves lost an April 1966 decision that stated they had violated antitrust law. This ruling was after the team had already moved to Atlanta. However, this decision was overturned on appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court because previous cases made it clear that Major League Baseball had been granted an antitrust exemption. It was official, the team would move after 1965 and become the Atlanta Braves in 1966. The team that kicked off baseball's flurry of relocations in 1953 would only last 13 seasons in their new city and would be the first move since 1902 to leave a city that had a team without one. Charlie Finley bought the Kansas City Athletics from the estate of Arnold Johnson in 1960. And from day one, Finley complained about the city of Kansas City and tried to move the team multiple times, looking at Dallas, Oakland, and Louisville. With his lease for Municipal Stadium in Kansas City ending after 1963, Finley signed a lease in 1964 to play in Louisville, but the league squashed that, voting 9-1 against the move. Frustrated at playing in the aging municipal stadium, which he was now sharing with the Kansas City Chiefs, Finley even threatened to move the A's 90 miles south to temporarily play in Peculiar, Missouri, which had a population of 206. Finley vowed to use a cow pasture rather than municipal stadium. The American League owners finally hit their limit and told Finley to either re-up the lease in Kansas City or they'd force him to forfeit the team. Finley relented and signed a 4-year lease to stay in Kansas City through 1967, although he was not happy about it. Finley had a bit of a promoter streak just like Bill Veeck. He signed the 59-year-old Satchel Paige to pitch for the A's for one game. Bert Campaneris played all 9 positions in a game. A live mule was made team mascot named Charlie O. Installed a mechanical rabbit on the field to deliver baseballs to the umpire, and to stick it to the league, he installed the pennant porch, which mimicked the right field dimensions in Yankee Stadium, which broke current MLB rules for being too short, but Yankee Stadium was grandfathered in. To technically not break the rules, the pennant porch jutted back out right before the foul line to meet current MLB rules. But despite these promotions and antics, on-field performance and attendance never improved through the 8 years he owned the team, never finishing higher than 7th in the American League and never reaching 800,000 fans in a season. Finley also meddled with the team and constantly clashed with and subsequently fired his managers. The Athletics had 8 different managers in those 8 seasons. Before the 4 years were up on Finley's lease, Kansas City approved a new stadium complex for the Athletics and Chiefs in 1967 to open in 1971. Finley demanded a redesign from the initial proposal of a multi-use dome stadium in downtown Kansas City to a 2-stadium complex on the southeast side of town because he refused to share a stadium with the Chiefs. With his new stadium complex approved right as his lease in Municipal Stadium was ending, Finley was for sure going to keep the Athletics in Kansas City, right? Nope. Just 4 months after the new stadium was approved, Finley announced he was moving the Athletics to Oakland for 1968, and this time the American League approved the move, which angered some politicians, specifically U.S. Senator from Missouri Stuart Symington, who saw his community approve an expensive stadium for Finley only for him to pack up his team and leave. Symington wanted his Kansas City baseball team back. When politicians want to pressure Major League Baseball to do something, what do? You can say it with me now, go after Major League Baseball's antitrust exemption. Symington said he proposed legislation to do so. It was a repeat of Representative Seller and Senator Kefauver in 1960 all over again. Symington was so angry at losing the Athletics and hated Charlie Finley so much that he called Finley one of the most disreputable characters ever to enter the American sports scene, and was even reported to have said Oakland is the luckiest city since Hiroshima, although that turned out to be a fake quote. To appease Symington, the American League agreed to expand by another 2 teams in 1971, a new franchise in Kansas City and another in Seattle. But that was not good enough for the angry politicians. They wanted the replacement team as soon as possible, and Symington still threatened legislation. The American League had an emergency session and agreed to move up the expansion to 1969. This was great for Kansas City, who already had existing Major League facilities, as well as a new stadium approved, and Symington, now a hero for getting baseball back in Kansas City so quickly, would throw out the first pitch for the Kansas City Royals' first game. But moving expansion up 2 years would cause problems for the Seattle franchise. We'll get into that later. 12 teams in the American League and only 10 in the National League was not something the owners wanted to see for an extended period of time. So in February of 1968, the National League got together and agreed to also have 2 expansion franchises in 1969, with bids coming from Milwaukee, Dallas, San Diego, Buffalo, and Montreal. Milwaukee was quickly ruled out as the league still held bitterness over the lawsuits and legal battles by the city when the Braves moved to Atlanta. Roy Hofheinz, owner of the Houston Astros, was against a second team in Texas, so Dallas was out. Buffalo Stadium was in a bad neighborhood to the point where their minor league team was playing night games at Niagara Falls 20 miles away, so they were ruled out. San Diego had the inside track because Walter O'Malley supported them, with Buzzy Bavasi, O'Malley's business partner and general manager with the Dodgers, set to be part owner and president of any San Diego expansion team, and Montreal sealed the deal when their mayor announced a new dome stadium to open by 1971. Although he didn't have city council approval for a new stadium, and the team wouldn't move into a new dome stadium until 1977, 6 years after what he promised when bidding for a team, after Olympic Stadium was built for the 1976 Summer Olympics. With that, it was settled. Due to the Kansas City Athletics moving to Oakland in 1968, Major League Baseball would have its second round of expansion with 4 new teams in 1969. The San Diego Padres and Montreal Expos in the National League, and the Kansas City Royals and Seattle Pilots in the American League. But as I mentioned before, moving Seattle's inaugural season up from 1971 to 1969 would cause some problems. Seattle was a desirable city for a Major League franchise years before they got one in 1969. The third largest metro area on the West Coast behind only Los Angeles and San Francisco, there were a number of attempts to move a team here in the mid-1960s. The Cleveland Indians and Charlie Finley's Athletics both looked at moving their franchises to Seattle. But there was one common issue that made both relocation attempts fall through: Sick's Stadium. It was the stadium for the PCL's Seattle Rainiers, and it was clear that it was not a major league facility. It had only 11,000 capacity and was extremely outdated. During his visit to Sick's Stadium, Finley called it a pigsty. Unlike Milwaukee, Minnesota, San Francisco, and Los Angeles that had either already built or promised a new stadium in their attempts to court a new major league team, there was no such promise in Seattle when trying to get either the Indians or Athletics. Meaning any team relocating there would have to play in the inadequate Sick's Stadium for an unknown period of time. If the expansion Seattle franchise had started in 1971, like the original expansion announcement had planned for, that would give Seattle 3 years to not only significantly upgrade 6 stadiums to serve as a temporary home for the Pilots, but also allow the franchise to get approval for a new dome stadium. Instead, the Pilots had to expedite the expansion of Sick's Stadium to be ready for opening day in 1969, and plans for a new dome stadium would still be in limbo throughout 1969 and wouldn't get final approval until 1971. The Seattle Pilots, starting in 1971 with an upgraded Sick's Stadium and approval for their new home, would have been a drastically different situation than what they were stuck with in 1969, where Sick's Stadium was still under construction on opening day, and it was unknown at the time how long approval would take to get their dome stadium.
Well, Sick's Stadium was clearly, an upgraded minor league ballpark. Probably wasn't even the best of the minor league ballparks, the AAA teams. But it was decent enough. We remember, of course, they were still building the damn thing even on opening day. People were lined up outside, and when they would nail down a section of wood in the bleachers, they didn't let in another 20 people.
Capacity at Sick's Stadium was just one of the many issues. Increasing a stadium from 11,000 capacity to 25,000 capacity on short notice brought a lot of other issues, the most significant being the plumbing.
But it was a thrown together facility, and we had a lot of problems. We couldn't flush the toilets in the press box until the 7th inning because the water pressure was down. And we had one instance where a fan sitting out in the portable bleachers out in right field got locked in a Santa can, and he didn't get out of there until the morning when they came to clean the places. He was pounding on it, but there was nobody there to hear him.
The on-field performance of the team didn't help either. A problem that many expansion teams faced is the players left unprotected in an expansion draft tended to be over-the-hill players and players with not a lot of future upside, especially in 1969 when there were 4 expansion teams at the same time quickly snatching up the few talented players unprotected in the expansion draft. Of the 8 expansion teams from 1961 through 1969, every single one had a losing season their first year, averaging 102 losses, and most of those teams took a significant amount of time before they found success. The Angels did manage a winning record in their second season, and the Royals managed a winning record in their third season, but the other 6 expansion teams all took at least 8 years before they saw their first winning season. Looking at the first 10 years of all 8 expansion teams, 80 seasons total, there were a combined 16 winning seasons. 6 were by the Royals, 4 were by the Angels, and 3 were by the Mets. The other 5 teams had a total of 3 winning seasons out of 50 total seasons. The draft strategies varied by the teams. A team like the Mets, realizing they weren't going to be good out of the gate, drafted younger players hoping to build up for the future. It's no surprise they lost 120 games in their inaugural season. Meanwhile, the Pilots held on to the hope that they could be good out of the gate and drafted older players that had previously had good seasons.
Well, I knew most of the people who were going to become Seattle Pilots. They were major league players from all over, a conglomeration of real great characters, but they were on the downward side.
It's hard to tell who was making those decisions because whoever was making them didn't really know much about sports because they made the mistake of drafting all older players. Their idea was that they were going to draft these old guys and they were going to be matching their best years, which were, way earlier. Those days were long gone. But they were going to draft these guys and they were going to have their best seasons, match their best seasons, and the Pilots were going to be pennant contenders right away. The Kansas City Royals, on the other hand, were pretty smart. They said, listen, it takes a long time to build a ball club. We're going to go with youth. And so they built a young team, and of course, they succeeded, and the Pilots did not succeed.
While they didn't lose 120 games like the Mets, they still weren't good, finishing in last place in the AL West and losing 98 games. And with an older roster and not many prospects, that wasn't going to improve anytime soon. With a dilapidated stadium, which kept fans from coming to the ballpark, a bad team, which kept fans from coming to the ballpark, and for some reason, some of the highest ticket prices in the league, which kept fans from coming to the ballpark, the Pilots did not have great attendance in 1969, averaging just over 8,000 fans a game. And that caused significant financial strain for William Daley and Dewey Soriano, who led the ownership group under Pacific Northwest Sports Incorporated. It was known throughout Seattle that the Pilots were not doing well financially, as Daley and Soriano looked to get local businessmen to purchase part of the team, as well as taking out loans to try to ride out the rough waves. The Bank of California issued Pacific Northwest Sports Incorporated a $3.5 million loan, and Daley tried to sell half of his ownership to local theater owner Fred Dance. Dance eventually put together a group of 20 more Seattle businessmen to try to put together a financial package that could keep the Pilots in Seattle. But it soon became clear that the financials of the Pilots, along with the debt on the books, that any investment in the team would most likely be a short-term prop-up with limited chances of success as long as the team remained in Sick's Stadium. The new Dome Stadium in Seattle still wasn't approved, and there seemed to be a number of roadblocks. It finally hit the fan when the Bank of California demanded immediate repayment of the $3.5 million loan, and Pacific Northwest Sports Incorporated filed for bankruptcy in March of 1970. This meant the fate of the Pilots would be determined in bankruptcy court by Sidney Volin, whose job was to ensure the best possible deal for the team's creditors. Meaning, if an outside group made a good offer to purchase the team, Volin could force the sale. An offer in the $8 to $12 million range is what it would take. But what sort of group could raise money like that in the few weeks that remained before the 1970 season? It would have to be a group planning the purchase of a team for years. Milwaukee car dealership owner Bud Selig was head of a consortium of Milwaukee business owners called Teams Incorporated, who, in 1965, tried their damnedest to purchase the Braves to keep them in Milwaukee. When that failed, the group renamed to Milwaukee Brewers Baseball Club Incorporated with the sole goal of getting Major League Baseball back in Milwaukee. Despite not owning a major league team, Selig would attend every MLB owners meeting, talking to anyone who would listen, trying to show Milwaukee had the funds and enthusiasm to support a major league team, and would take an expansion team or buy an existing team to relocate to Milwaukee. MLB team owners were not amused. When Selig wasn't inside the conference room with the owners, he could often be found loitering in the hotel lobby. We'd look behind a potted palm and there would be Buddy. Baseball executive Peter Bavasi joked. Selig found himself generally not welcome at baseball owners' meetings. Many owners simply referred to him as that Buddy guy from Milwaukee. American League President Joe Cronin had little time for Selig and once asked him what he was doing at their meeting. The league was still angry about Milwaukee dragging the Braves through court and threatening MLB's antitrust exemption, and mostly disregarded Selig. It's entirely possible the owners and executives may have listened to Selig had he been lobbying for baseball to place a franchise in any other city than Milwaukee. Baseball didn't want to come back here under any circumstances, Seelig said. We'd go to baseball meetings and we were treated like we had leprosy. MLB continuously denied Milwaukee an expansion club and didn't pay Seelig any attention. But Seelig did eventually find an ally in White Sox owner Arthur Allen, with Allen even stating the Braves moving to Atlanta was partially his fault. The Braves ownership group, headed by William Bartholomew and Thomas Reynolds, previously held 46% of the White Sox. I, like a fool, bought out their share and made it possible for them to come up here and move your club to Atlanta. He continued, I'm sure that if I could get the opportunity again, I'd never let them out of my grasp. Seelig proposed the White Sox play a regular season game in Milwaukee on July 24, 1967 against the Twins. This game was a smashing success, setting the record for attendance in Milwaukee County Stadium with 51,144 fans in attendance. The league took notice and realized maybe Milwaukee was a baseball city that could support a major league franchise. Twins owner Calvin Griffith was equally impressed and told the press that he would propose a franchise for Milwaukee at the summer owners meeting. He also said he'd cast a vote in favor of the move by the Kansas City Athletics to Milwaukee if owner Charlie Finley ever brought up the subject. When asked if baseball's owners could ignore such a large turnout, Griffith stated, "Hell no. I thought 20,000 to 25,000 would be a hell of a crowd." For 1968, Allen's White Sox scheduled 9 home games in Milwaukee, which ended up with a total attendance of 246,478, just over 27,000 fans a game. In the 58 White Sox games played in Comiskey Park, they drew 579,478 fans, or just over 9,000 fans a game. In 1969, the White Sox scheduled 11 home games in Milwaukee. While not as successful as 1968, those 11 games still averaged over 18,000 a game, triple what the White Sox were drawing at home. There were even some rumors that the White Sox would relocate to Milwaukee, which both Allen and Seelig denied, with Seelig stating the Brewers would not be party to luring an established club away from another city. The key word being established. The Pilots had clearly not established themselves as a staple of Seattle, hadn't developed the fan base or local support to be able to save the team, and this was the perfect opportunity for Seelig and the Milwaukee Brewers Baseball Club Incorporated to swoop in. Seattle had very short notice to create their expansion team and didn't have the major league facilities, deep pocketbooks, or even planning to make it a financial success. Meanwhile, Seelig's group had spent the last 4 years planning for this, raising not only funds and backers, but building fan enthusiasm in Milwaukee for a major league team. With Pacific Northwest Sports going to bankruptcy court just weeks before the 1970 season, it looked like Milwaukee's moment had come. Through most of spring training, the Seattle Pilots remained the Seattle Pilots on the field, but there was uncertainty of who they would be or where they would play once the 1970 season began. As their equipment truck left their spring training facility in Tempe, Arizona, the driver was told to drive as far north as Provo, Utah, and then await word whether he would be going to Seattle or Milwaukee. In bankruptcy court, Sidney Volin waited to see if there was any offer from any Seattle-based group to buy the Pilots, but there was none. Finally, on April 1st, 1970, just 6 days before the start of the season, Volin approved the sale of the team to Milwaukee for $10.8 million, which was apparently the only offer for the team the bankruptcy court received. Seelig stated upon learning that he had gotten his baseball team, "It was a long, tough 5.5 years with a lot of rejection and a lot of sadness," Seelig confessed. "Then the ultimate happened. Nothing will ever give me the satisfaction that landing the team did." For the second time in 5 years, a major league team had relocated, leaving its previous city without a team. Seattle would eventually approve their new dome stadium, even without a team, and the King Dome would open in 1976, and Seattle would get the replacement team in 1977 with the expansion Seattle Mariners. Calvin Griffith moved the Washington Senators to Minneapolis in 1960, but Washington got a new expansion Senators in 1961. As we've already covered, most teams move when their current situation isn't too great, whether it be due to debt, fan interest, on-field performance, etc. And we've also covered that expansion teams throughout the 1960s usually were very bad for a very long time, and in many cases had inexperienced ownership groups that didn't know what they were getting into. Washington, D.C. getting one of these expansion teams immediately after another team had fled the city due to financial reasons was about as predictable of a "this isn't going to work" situation as you can get. Calvin Griffith's last year in Washington had a team with 81 losses that drew 740,000 through the gates. The first season of the new Washington Senators had 100 losses and under 600,000 fans in attendance. Elwood Quesada led the ownership group for this new Senators team and told stockholders in February before their first season that they would need to draw 800,000 fans to only have an operating loss of 60,000. Instead, they lost $250,000. Not a great start to the new franchise. Year 2 was a 101-loss season, drawing 730,000 fans, a slight increase, but still reported a loss of $125,000. Over the next 7 years, this trend would continue. In 1966, it was estimated the franchise had lost a total of $2 million. Initially with 10 owners in the ownership group at the start in 1961, as time went on, more and more of them wanted out and were bought out by the remaining owners, where in 1968 the Senators had consolidated to just 2 of the 10 original owners, James Lemon and the estate of James Johnson, who had died the previous year. Lemon did not have the funds to buy out Johnson's estate and couldn't maintain his ownership with how the franchise was hemorrhaging money and ended up selling to Minnesota businessman Robert Short, thinking Short would keep the team in Washington. But it became clear pretty quickly that Short was looking at different markets. Short claimed the team had $600,000 in losses in 1969, saying, "I hate to use the word bankrupt, but if it weren't for television and radio income, that's the way it would be." Looking to simultaneously cut payroll, but also try to excite fans by getting a proven name, he made a disastrous trade in October of 1970, giving up 4 young players for 2-time Cy Young winner Denny McLain, who would go on to lead the league in losses in 1971, going 10-22. "I had to do something, I'm going broke," Short said in defense of the McLain trade. "He will put people in my ballpark."
They were horrendous. And so Short's attendance was going this way. His financial bank accounts were going this way.
Short said he had lost $1.8 million in his first 2 years as Senators owner. "I can't maintain the team under the present condition. I don't want to move to Dallas or Toronto. I want the team to stay in Washington." In 1971, Short began discussions of bankruptcy, stating, "There is no way Bob Short can operate the Senators in Washington any longer," and he began looking at offers from other cities. Tom Vandergraff was the mayor of Arlington, Texas, a suburb smack dab in the middle of Dallas and Fort Worth. In the post-World War II boom, Vandergraff saw his town as somewhat of a sister city to Anaheim, California, a suburb in a key location in a booming metro area that would be perfect for large industries and giant attractions to put them on the map and promote growth. Anaheim had Disneyland and the California Angels, and Vandergraff wanted similar attractions in Arlington. He brought in a giant General Motors plant in 1954. He met with Walt Disney to try to get a second Disneyland location in Arlington, which fell through but eventually led to the development and opening of Six Flags Over Texas in 1961, the first Six Flags park in the country. Next on his list of attractions for Arlington was a Major League Baseball team. In 1964, the city built Turnpike Stadium for the Texas League's Dallas-Fort Worth Spurs. It only had a capacity of 10,000, but was built in a way that it could expand to 50,000 if needed and met Major League requirements. Vandergraff had petitioned for one of the 1969 expansion teams to come to Arlington, but Roy Heffheinz, owner of the Astros, blocked that to keep Major League competition out of the state. If Vandergraff was going to get a Major League team in his city, it would have to be through relocation of an existing team. To that end, Vandergraff started building relationships with different owners across the league, which put him in touch with Robert Short. Vandergraff gave Short an unbelievable offer. Arlington would give Short $7.5 million over 10 years just for the radio and TV rights to the team if Short moved them to Texas. Considering Short was receiving offers around that amount for the entire team at the time, this was an incredibly generous offer that Short couldn't refuse. There were individuals looking to buy the Senators and keep them in Washington in 1971, most notably Bill Veeck and Bob Hope. It's crazy how Veeck appears in almost all of these stories, but once Vandergraff and Arlington had offered his deal to move, Short raised the price for the franchise to any local buyers to $12.4 million, an amount he claimed would cover what he had paid for the team and for the money he had lost. This was an absurd price considering Short had bought the team 2 years prior for $9.4 million, and the team had lost money every year since. Nobody took him up on that $12.4 million, and Short finally petitioned the league to allow him to move to Arlington. Like when Calvin Griffith moved out of Washington, there was some grumblings from politicians in Washington, even from the President of the United States himself.
And he was open to a move of his franchise against a lot of opposition, including the President of the United States at the time, Richard Nixon. There's a famous story that he sent his son-in-law, David Eisenhower, to RFK Stadium to talk to Short, and just happened that Tom Vandergriff was there meeting with Short when David Eisenhower showed up, and Robert Short told Vandergriff, look, he can't see you here. So he put him in a closet in his office. And David Eisenhower came in, made an impassioned plea from President Nixon.
On the day the league was to vote on the move, a handwritten message from Nixon was delivered to Vandergriff saying, I implore you, repeat, I implore you, do not move the nation's national pastime from the nation's capital. But it was all for naught. In a 10-2 vote, the American League approved Short moving the Washington Senators to Arlington, where they would become the Texas Rangers. On September 30th, 1971, the Washington Senators played their last game, and their radio play-by-play announcer, Ron Menchine, knowing he wasn't going with the team to Arlington, didn't hold back his disgust.
I think sooner or later, baseball is going to discover that they're going to have to promote and build up, not run out of town. The two-strike pitch, swung on and fouled back. You can't keep running forever. You've got to build this great game up. There's no finer sport than baseball, and there are no finer fans than those in Washington. The American League club owners took the coward's way out. And now there's no baseball team for the time being, but maybe someday soon there will be.
With the Senators down 5-1 with the Yankees, Frank Howard came to the plate in the bottom of the 6th and hit what would be the last home run in Washington Senators history.
Senators trail 5-1. But they have time to catch the Yankees. There's a long drive to left field. This one is going. It is gone. Frank Howard has just hit home run number 26. And again, he gets a standing ovation. The cheers for Hondo, who waved his batting helmet to the fans. I just wish the owners of the American League could see this. The ones who voted 10-2 to move this club out of Washington.
This sparked a Senators rally, and they scored 3 more runs in the inning, as well as 2 runs in the bottom of the 8th to take a 7-5 lead. With 2 outs in the top of the 9th, 1 out away from the Senators winning their last game, the fans stormed the field. One fan grabbed first base and ran off with it. Other fans scooped up dirt. Some started taking apart the scoreboard.
A mass of bodies on the field. Now fans are converging upon the scoreboard. And again, the souvenir hunters are trying to get anything from the stadium. They are succeeding, and reinforcements have been called, and hopefully the field will be cleared so we can get the final out in this historic ball game.
Realistically, we wanted to take the National Guard to get them out here, because there won't be much left of the scoreboard. It's like an army of ants out there going through the jungle. They're just chopping away at everything they can get their hands on.
It's a shame they couldn't have waited for one more out, but they didn't. And now the job at hand is to try and clear the field so this ball game can continue. The scoreboard has been completely decimated. Nothing remains. I believe Bert Hawkins has just said that this game will be forfeited to New York.
It has been.
Well, it's a strange way to lose a ball game.
And with that, Major League Baseball's era of relocations was over. 10-team relocations in just a 20-year period. Major League Baseball would not see a team move for the next 33 years, although there would be 6 expansion teams in that time. The Seattle Mariners, Toronto Blue Jays, Colorado Rockies, Florida Marlins, Arizona Diamondbacks, and Tampa Bay Devil Rays. The Montreal Expos would be the next team to move, this time to Washington, D.C. to become the Nationals in 2005. And then the Oakland Athletics would move to Sacramento in 2025 with plans to go to Las Vegas in the future.
Go, you pilots, you proud Seattle team. Go, you pilots, go out and build a dream. You brought the majors to the evergreen Northwest. Now go, you pilots, you're going to be the best.